I teach woody plants a little bit differently than maybe what you might have been expecting, in that I don't actually spend a lot of time in this particular class talking about specifically about trees, different kinds of trees. Although we will get to that, and maybe we'll have more time for that depending on how this goes. Um, because I feel like there's some good resources out there, and I'll point you towards some of those. Um, but because I feel like there's a lot of about the care and biology and kind of how they grow that is actually more important in a lot of ways than tree selection, or at least is a part that we don't hear that much about, and that I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions in the community about how trees grow and the root systems and those kinds of things. So when I talk about trees, um, what I'm really looking at is the classic definition really is a dominant central leader, typically taller than 15 feet. And a shrub is something with multiple upright branches, usually less than 15 feet tall. But there are obviously there's a big gray area between those two. And I'm not worried about splitting hairs, whether something's a tall shrub or a small tree. It doesn't really matter. But this is kind of what the typical working definitions are in the industry. Then there are also woody vines and ground covers. And there are actually a lot of woody plants like trees that are ground covers now, prostrate shrubs. I mean, you can even get Scotch pine. There's a variety of Scotch pine that basically doesn't really get above about 1 to 2 feet tall. So it's just kind of this ground cover type of plant. So the lines have been blurred a lot between some of these sections, especially with the breeding that the industry has done over the last 2 or 3 decades to try and make plants genetically dwarfed so that they fit into smaller yards and onto patios and those kinds of things, since the typical home landscape is becoming smaller. And then I like to just kind of mention this, and this is also the case whether we're talking about woody plants or herbaceous plants, but that the difference between the natural form of of a plant and the desired landscape goal, that kind of equals the amount of maintenance required. So we talk about bringing plants into, say, the arid West or to Utah, like blueberries, for example. Like Terrell talked about blueberries last week, and it is possible to grow blueberries in Utah, um, but because of their exact requirements for acidic soil, particularly, we have to put in a great deal of time and money in managing that environment to make up that difference from whatever our goal is, for example. So we look at the same thing, like if we have a silver maple, for example, we're probably going to have to use iron treatments and to keep it happy, because it's not going to be able to use the iron that we have here. So just understand that um, if you want a large tree in a small space, there's going to be conflict, and you're going to have to manage that conflict, pay for maintenance, do maintenance, or you're going to have to do a lot of pruning or remove it in the future and those kinds of things. So the benefits of woody plants, of course, there's a lot of them. They provide the basic structure, or what a lot of landscape designers refer to as the skeleton of a landscape. They have high aesthetic value, which means they tend to command a lot of beauty. They reduce runoff and erosion, and they do this really kind of in two main ways. One of them is that the root systems usually will penetrate through the top soil layer and thereby help keep soils from eroding. But then they also intercept rainfall by the leaves, and then as the precipitation runs off the leaves and the branches, it tends to actually slow down its movement across soils. They obviously create windbreaks. One question that I've gotten quite a bit of in the past about using trees for windbreaks is, do trees block sound? So can you plant a lot of trees next to a busy street, like a lot of evergreen trees next to a busy street, and have that planting block the noise from the road? And the general answer is no. Trees themselves don't do a very good job of creating sound barriers. And so if you're going to use, they're actually better as visual barriers, and they will break up the wind to some extent. But in order to really block sound, the research shows that those woody plants need to be used in combination with berms, which are mounds of earth, hit basically artificial hills, which actually are really good at deflecting sound. So they have a cooling effect, which is, you know, a large tree might use 100 gallons of water a day or more, and all that water is lost by evaporation, which cools the environment. So it's kind of similar to you walking on a lawn in the summer, and the lawn is cold on your feet because of the cooling effect that it has. They tend to also increase property values, and overall, trees typically are the most expensive pieces of the landscape, in that they typically have a high individual plant cost. They may have a high installation cost, and then replacement cost is typically high if they fail. And then there's also the cost of time that's lost if it's a tree that's been growing for a number of years and then fails, or is the wrong tree for that spot. So they tend to be fairly expensive. I know people are alarmed a lot of times when they find out how much it might take to trim or remove a large tree. And typically when people have talked to me about, you know, what would it cost to remove this large tree, and I have done some tree removals myself, but really large trees, typically speaking, if you call an arborist, they're going to run usually around $4,000 and up to remove a single large tree. So they can be pretty expensive to remove and replace. So we want to get it right. That's kind of where I'm going with this, is we want to try and get it right, and understand what their needs are, so that we have a better chance of putting the right tree in the right place. And of course, what I'm talking about trees is also applies to shrubs, although since typically they're smaller, and a lot easier to work with, we oftentimes don't quite have the same kinds of issues with some of the shrubs as we do with the trees. Proper tree selection then is one of the most critical activities for the success of the tree, and to create that kind of skeleton, or that success in the landscape, whatever that we're trying to do in the landscape. And there's lots of ways that we can select trees for their suitability in a given environment. And so the one that we usually first look at, and probably is one of the most important filters when looking at a plant list, is the hardiness. What kind of cold, typically we're talking about cold hardiness, what kind of cold can these plants handle? And so for us here in the Wasatch Front, most of us are probably in a zone 6, possibly even a 7A. And then as we go down in southern Utah, of course, it gets a lot warmer than that, even up to zones 9, 9B. And so basically what that means is that for most of us, where we live in Utah County, maybe Salt Lake County, we're looking at an average winter low of around -5 degrees. And so 0 to -5. And so, yeah, there might be some years that are a little colder than that, but on average, we're around that. So that's one criteria right off. And so that's why banana trees won't grow here typically, is just because the wintertime is too cold. We also look at size and growth rate. One of the big questions I get all the time from people is, I want a tree that grows fast, but isn't messy. And we'll talk more about that, but there's a big trade-off between anything that grows fast. They tend to also die fast and have a lot of problems. So they tend to party. These are the partiers, I call it. These are the partiers. And so then they tend to have a lot of challenges later on in life with weak wood, those kind of things. And they typically don't live very long either. So, and then ultimately the size, and as I mentioned, you know, right now in the industry, their breeders are working a lot more on size management, just genetically. Tolerances. This becomes important for us because we typically have, so tolerances is like looking at trees that might be tolerant to salt or wind, or high pH or clay soils, or those kinds of things, or pollution. And some of those tolerances become particularly important here in Utah, because we typically are growing on salty soils or saline soils, and so we kind of look at salt tolerance as being a key criteria. Drought tolerance is another big one. But we can also look at trees that are, say, really good in wet areas. So at Thanksgiving Point, we had an area when we were building the tree tour and putting in a bunch of trees for the tree tour. We identified an area down in the garden that was always wet because the kind of is a collection point for several different drainage portions on campus. So we put bald cypress in there, which can actually handle pretty much growing in a swamp. So in fact, that's where they grow native, and they're actually doing really well because they can tolerate that kind of condition. So another thing is shape and form. So if we have a landscape that doesn't have a lot of room, we can find plants that are narrower in shape, or we want to block a view, we can pick a low growing one that has a broad form. For example, something like the wireless. The wireless is called the wireless zelkova, which is a type of zelkova or a cultivar of zelkova that is very broad and very short. And then sometimes we want to know, does it have fruit or other nuisances? Oftentimes, fruit on most landscape trees is considered a nuisance. Not always, but often it is considered a nuisance. So we consider the site, the slope, the wind, the drainage, the exposure, the water, all those kinds of things. And I want to add to this list the size, the rooting volume, the canopy volume, all those kinds of things. But I wanted to show you guys this. If you're not familiar with it already, there's this USU Extension Forestry has put together this software called Tree Browser, and it's available for mobile devices as well. I have it on my phone, but it's a web-based app. If you go to it online just through a web browser. So I'm going to go to that, and I'm going to switch my sharing so that you guys can see this. Okay, so now you should be able to see the tree browser. I pulled up the website, treebrowser.org. And so there's 245 trees here. And of course, right now they're alphabetically by common name. But you can, probably one of the most valuable features about this software is that, first of all, almost all these trees will grow well in Utah. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean we would recommend all of them, but that they all will typically grow in most areas in Utah. But you have the ability to either sort by common name or Latin name, which I'll leave it at common name for now. But you have this criteria right here called select characteristics. And so when you click on that, this is where we can go in and look at filtering this list of 245 trees based on hardiness zone or type. So if we wanted only broadleaf plants or a Utah native, and we want to look at growth. So for example, at growth, if we look at growth rate, a lot of people they want a high growth rate. So if I look at something that grows fast and is tall, so mature height is high, and crown shape, any, I'll just leave that any. Then you can see what's happening is if I, let's see, let's change this to tolerant of alkalinity, medium to high, and then we'll click search. And so you can see now that it got that list of 245 trees down to 26 trees that meet that criteria. And so then we can go through that list and kind of filter it directly, but it gives us more of a working list. And so I recommend this to a lot of people when they say, well, what should I grow in my yard? And I say, start with Tree Browser and filter out some of the criteria that you for sure don't want in a tree. And then look at that list and then go to the nurseries from there, but that gives you a starting point. And then certainly going to the nurseries will give you a lot more options. So I picked fast growing trees, and so these are all pretty much fast growing trees. And the reason that I pick fast growing trees is that the vast majority of them I don't recommend that you plant, just simply because they are trashy and they tend to cause a lot of conflict between people and the environment we want. And what their habit is. And so there are a few of these, though, that while they do grow fast, tend to not be that problematic. And I'm going to point those out right now because I typically get asked this. So I'm going to start out right here with green ash at the top real quick. And green ash actually is quite well adapted to Utah and the Intermountain West, and is planted widely across North America. There are ash forests that are of this species and related species. We're not recommending that this tree be planted anymore because it is very susceptible to a pest called the emerald ash borer, or the EAB, and that is an introduced pest. And a few years ago, it was found in Boulder, Colorado, and so it's actually become well established in Colorado at this point. And it was moved to Colorado through some firewood that was transported illegally. And this pest destroys many things in the ash family. It will take out all of Utah's native ash trees as well if it can get them in the forests. And there are places in the eastern U.S. where they have ash forests that have been completely destroyed because of this particular insect. And there really isn't anything that we've been able to do to keep this pest from being problematic. So that's just kind of where we're at with it. And so we're just recommending that it not be used because there's a high propensity for this pest to get to Utah, and it may already be here, just hasn't been detected. The other ones I wanted to go down basically are really just kind of trashy. Catalpa grows fast. It's not particularly messy except for the bean pod, so that's one I wouldn't necessarily scratch off the list. But certainly the cottonwoods typically grow fast and are pretty messy. The other one I wouldn't scratch off the list here would be, or that I would potentially use, are elms. And now this is showing American elm, which you can't really find American elm as a species anymore. It was wiped out by Dutch elm disease pretty much throughout North America, which was an introduced pest. That the fungus is a fungus that actually gets introduced by a beetle that feeds on the tree, and it kills them. So Elm Street, all the elm streets in America used to be lined with elm trees, of course, and now they're all gone. So there's been a lot of work hybridizing elms, and so elms are still a good choice overall, especially a lot of the hybrid elms that may use American elm as one of the parents, but they're using some European and other species that have a lot more resistance to Dutch elm disease. And so we're starting to see a resurgence of elm coming back into the landscape, and overall they make good trees. But this culprit right here, Siberian elm, is bad. And the unfortunate part about this, and I should talk to Mike Coons, the extension forestry specialist, about this, is that Siberian elm, or Elmus pumila, is also often called Chinese elm. But the common name Chinese elm actually refers to a tree specifically called Ulmus parvifolia. And it's a very different elm tree, and that one is highly recommended for Utah. It's very drought tolerant and does really well, but is not weedy in any way, and doesn't really even have much of the disease problems that Siberian elm or Ulmus pumila does. And so that one's Ulmus parvifolia. Hackberry also, I would recommend that one's a good one. I see it looking pretty sparse in most cases, but it will typically grow well here and without being a weed. Honey locust, that's a weed if you get seed pods produced on it, but the cultivars that you can buy in the nurseries are male cultivars, and they call them mostly seedless. So I have one in my yard, a honey locust. I have an imperial honey locust, and it gets about 3 seed pods on it a year, maybe 5 seed pods on it a year. So it's mostly seedless. By and large, everything else on this list I would really restrict or really discourage you from planting very much of, except for these last two again on here: yellow poplar or tulip tree. If you have a big yard, these are lovely trees. And then the Japanese Zelkova, which is also a very lovely tree. It was actually used as an elm replacement when Dutch elm disease wiped out all the elms. and it's in the elm family, but is not susceptible to Dutch elm disease, uh, and is actually a really good tree for our area. So I would recommend that one as well. So that's Tree Browser. It's a good way to start filtering through these things. But one thing it doesn't have typically, if we go back down to Zelkova, it doesn't have a lot on the different cultivars that are available. So I mentioned one cultivar that was available for Zelkova, and he does list some cultivars down here at the bottom. But there's one on here that doesn't have a more newer variety. It's called Wireless, and it is a Zelkova that is genetically dwarfed and is suitable for use in most areas under power lines. And so that's why they call it wireless, is they can handle being planted under those overhead wires typically. It only gets about 20 feet tall, where the species of the Zelkova will be a 40-foot tall tree typically. Okay, so this is a good question. Why do you not recommend London plane tree or sycamore? So for a lot of years, we actually recommended London plane tree as a really good tree for Utah. What's happened in the last, oh gosh, the last 20 years that I've seen, there's two diseases that are really problematic with London plane tree. One of them is powdery mildew, which the tree can usually deal with pretty good. I have seen in some areas where the plantings are really dense that powdery mildew could really defoliate them in late summer. The big reason why we don't recommend London plane tree anymore is that it's just being destroyed by another fungal disease called sycamore anthracnose. And the plant pathologists are still telling us that they've never seen it kill trees, but based on what I've seen around like UVU's campus, and Ton and I went out there I think a year ago or so to actually help them figure out what's going on with them. They're losing trees to anthracnose, and what it does is it causes the disease causes the tips to die back, or it kills the growing points, which then is like topping a tree, and so then they get these witches brooms with a lot of weak wood, and then they have to re-leaf out. So there are fungal sprays for it, but they're marginally effective, especially when you consider that the London plane tree, I'm going to search for it here, is typically a very large tree. So it's hard to spray something that gets, something that gets that large. It's just hard to spray it effectively and make it uniformly covered with the fungicide. And most fungicides also are preventives. So once the tree has it, you usually can't cure the infection. You can just try and keep it from reestablishing in a future year. So there are some cultivars that are supposed to be more disease resistant to sycamore anthracnose. Both Ton and I have observed that those plants genetically still don't seem to be dealing with it very well, and it might just be because we planted so many of these trees now. The disease pressure is just really, really high. And resistant, when we say a tree is resistant to a disease or a plant's resistant to a disease, it doesn't mean it's immune to it. Does that make sense? So all right. What's a good windbreak? All my poplars blew down. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more later, but the best windbreaks, honestly, are combination plantings between conifers or the needled evergreens and some taller deciduous types of trees. And there's actually some good articles that have been put out by the EPA on creating windbreaks, as well as some extension articles as it applies to reducing like utility costs and stuff, especially in the winter. So there is some online resources there to help you with that. I'm not actually too familiar with creating large windbreaks with trees, but I do know that it usually creates a mix of staggered planting, and to really effectively make a windbreak, you need quite a bit of land to do it. So, and Becky's saying we took down one of these last year because it was dying. The leaves were dry and died in the summer. That most likely is that sycamore anthracnose causing those problems with the leaves. Linden trees. So Brent's asking about linden trees. Linden's great. I actually love linden trees. Let's go and look at them real quick. Oh, I have to get out of my search. There we go. We can reset all this. And we do linden. So linden or basswood, there are actually really 4 species of linden that will grow here pretty well. And you can see all 4 of them here on this list. There's the American linden, Crimean linden, which is really hard to find. That would be a fun one if you could find that one. Then there's little leaf linden and silver linden. And the major problem with linden, well, there's 2 that I'm really familiar with. One of them is that they tend to get aphid problems pretty bad. And the second one is that they tend to shed a lot because of the way that they flower. So when they flower, they have a little leaf that comes out that looks like a bract. That's actually a bract, something that subtends the flower. I'm just trying to see if he's got. Yeah, you can see it here on this picture that I'm sharing. Here you can see these leaves right here, kind of these tan. They look like leaves that are dying, but that's a bract that actually is a modified leaf that kind of tends to the flower. And those can be kind of messy. So, but linden trees make fantastic honey. So if you're into honey, plant linden trees. It's very, very sweet honey that's made from linden. So, all right. And Lisa's asking about, oh, let's see, go up. Lynette's asking about, I have 5 in my yard, I'm assuming 5 London plane trees or sycamores. We had ours sprayed and trimmed. They bounced back. Will they eventually die? The disease pressure is just so high that they'll eventually recontract the disease, and chances are they didn't eradicate it. And so the kind of the odds are against them right now. But really, what it boils down to is you're probably going to have to continually have them sprayed. So 3 huge ash trees starting to die, probably 40 or more years old. Looks like borers in the bark. So yeah, an ash tree actually does have aphid problems as well, and they tend to get what's called ash lilac borer, which can be problematic, and it tends to attack even healthy trees, but is more of a problem on stress trees. So I wouldn't replant with green ash. I would look for some other options, and there's a lot out there. Like I said, I would consider Zelkovas or lindens, even some of the hawthorns, as long as you can handle trees that have some thorns. So, all right. So let's move on. Let me go back to my PowerPoint here. All right. So I just wanted to talk about the different ways that plants are available and what the differences are. There's of course containerized plants, which is what we're most familiar with, just plants in a pot. There's balled and burlap plants, and then there's bare root. So container plants offer, this is what the industry standard is: a container plant. There's a year-round availability. We can plant trees from containers anytime the ground isn't frozen. We usually typically get good establishment, and there's just a whole bunch of variety of sizes and prices, from small ones in flats to big 25 or bigger gallon stuff. So, and what you're seeing in the picture here, that's Jerry Goodspeed, who's at the Botanical Center in Kaysville, with a $25,000 Japanese maple. This is typical of large trees in California, where they're grown in these large boxes. They're grown in these boxes as a container so that they can be moved by forklift, and they're often planted in areas under power lines and utility areas where they can't have anything permanent planted. And so that's why you see them in those big containers like that. They're relatively easy to plant. except for when they get really large like this. And one of the reasons that makes containerized plants easy to plant is that the pots are filled with potting soil typically, maybe sometimes a little bit of sand, and so for just a little bit of weight. Um, but they're filled with potting soil, which is much lighter than field soil. So they can usually get a lot of them on a truck, for example, to ship them. They're easy for most homeowners and landscapers to plant without a lot of trouble. One of the problems that they do have, though, is circling roots. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, where the roots just hit the side of the container and want to keep circling. And ideally, they shouldn't be kept too long in the same container. So like one season is typically enough. Sometimes there are more seasons if they're not sold fast enough. Balled and burlapped. So these are plants that are field grown, and then they're dug with a machine, and so they actually contain a ball of actual field soil. So these are really heavy. There's less availability with these than with container plants. They are typically larger sizes. So this is what people typically get when they say, I want that. I want an instant landscape. I want a 20-foot tree. They're probably going to be getting it in balled and burlapped. So they typically offer good establishment, but the root ball is fragile, which is why they wrap it in wire and burlap and then all this twine. But they tend to also run very expensive. So a tree like the one that they're wrapping there, and Tom can chime in on this because he's worked with this actual company where this has taken place. This is up at J&J Nursery in Layton. But this tree is probably going to cost around $400 to $500. And you probably won't be able to plant this yourself because it probably weighs about 700 pounds.
We used to see people come in like minivans and try to haul those off, and they don't realize that it weighs so much. And then once you get it home, how do you get it out of your truck or van? You've got to have a front end loader or a really sturdy tree cart. And people just don't realize the logistics into planting this size of a tree, and oftentimes smaller trees will actually establish more quickly.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, part of my graduate research was actually investigating the reestablishment of different sizes of trees, and we actually did find that, and other people have found that as well. That smaller trees they go through less transplant shock, and what we mean by establish, that means that they basically um, start to grow again at the rate they were growing before they were moved. So that's what really establishment means, is that they're regrowing at their normal rate. They've adjusted and now they're regrowing at the normal rate. So there's that instant direct gratification, large caliper sizes, but they're heavy. And so this is a picture of the
Mike,
machine.
there's a question
Yeah.
about how to actually plant these correctly. So how to get the wire basket off and things like that.
Oh, I'll cover that.
Sounds
I'll
good.
cover about doing these. Let me just look at the questions. Yeah, we'll talk about that. So if you bear with it. So I wanted to actually show. So this is a picture of a typical machine that's used to harvest these, and there's bigger ones and smaller ones, and there's some that these machines that they'll put on the back of semi trucks, and they have to back this semi truck in to your yard or to a nursery. So this is actually then they're field digging, and so you can see here there's these 4 hydraulic rams. At the bottom of each one of these rams is a shovel, and they open this swing door at the front, drive this apparatus around the tree. You can see the tree sticking up right in the middle of that. So they center the tree inside that hole, and then they drive each one of these hydraulic shovels down into the ground. And if you're standing in the air, you can hear the roots being cut. It's actually kind of sad in my opinion. But they cut through. Most of the root system will be removed. Typically say around 90% of the root system's removed during this process. And that's because most of the roots are spread out over a really wide area, typically 3 times the canopy distance and maybe more. And we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes too. And then after it's driven down into the ground, all those shovels meet together and make a bowl, and then the tree is lifted up out of the ground. And then you can see there's one in the machine right now. The machine is holding it. Then they actually hang this burlap basket, or there's burlap sack underneath it, and set the tree down inside that burlap and the wire, and then they form the wire and tie the wire off around the top. And so it's really important that these be handled really carefully, because if the root ball is damaged and that soil is cracked or falls off of the root system, then you end up with a really expensive bare root tree. So I cringe when I see landscape companies like dragging these off the backs of their trailers and they just let them thump on the ground and things. It's really hard on the root systems. So we'll get to planting in just a second. So in just a few minutes. So the rule of thumb with balled and burlapped is that, and actually I've seen this also for containerized plants. Especially since in most containerized plants we have to disturb the root systems a little bit anyways. For every inch of trunk caliper, it takes 1 year to reestablish. And for every inch of trunk caliper, you should have 10 to 12 inches of a root ball. So what do we say? What do we mean by trunk caliper? So typically the industry standard, and again, Ton, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but typically they measure the caliper, or how thick the stem is, 4 to 6 inches above the root flare. So from where this tree is tied, they go up about 6 inches, and that's where they measure the thickness. And I've been charged at the nurseries, when I go to the nurseries to buy trees, they measure that thickness at the register, and they say, okay, for a tree that's 2 1/4 inches in caliper, it's $165 for that.
Yeah, they do it down there. It depends on the nursery. Some of them do it at chest height, and some of them do it at the base of the trunk. But you get more money if you do it at the base of the trunk.
Yeah, exactly, because they naturally widen as they get to the base. So anyway, so there's not a whole lot of the root system left, and these are, again, of course, really heavy. And we'll talk about planting and the planting hole. I put up here the planting hole should be 2 to 3 times wider than the root ball, and that's actually we're gonna apply that globally to all the things that we plant. So for this particular tree, we got a 32-inch basket, and this is something around a 2.5-inch caliper, 2 to 2.5-inch caliper tree. And there are standards in the nursery industry for how big the root ball has to be based on the type of tree it is, and how big that tree is. So typically, evergreens tend to need wider root balls than a lot of the deciduous trees do, and so there's a different industry standard for those. Let's see, are there any questions that I need to field?
I think we're good for now.
Okay.
Oh, when I have planted a new tree, I insert a PVC pipe down at the roots, then cover the roots. As the tree is established, I can water the roots by putting water in the pipe. This is great during our hot summers. What do you think of that one?
Okay, maybe I'll address that question when we talk about root development. So let's hold off on that one. So bare root plants. These are plants that are available in the early spring. Bare root is just what the name implies. There's no soil on the roots. So you can see here what this worker is holding is a tree that's been recently harvested. And about 95% of the root system is removed typically in these cases. So you also, to the homeowner, these trees are generally not very available. So when they are available, you'll find them now at the garden centers and the chain stores. And typically what you'll find is small peach trees, small fruit trees, sometimes roses, some of the small flowering shrubs and those kind of things. And they usually come packed in a bag with moist sawdust around the roots. And they're typically pretty inexpensive because they can pack a lot of them on the truck, and so they don't cost nearly as much to ship. They can give good establishment, but planting timing is crucial. They got to get planted, and they need to start rooting out before the leaves break, before the buds break, because they don't have a root system to support leaf development. And then they you can get good establishment from them, but they need more careful aftercare. So so they're less forgiving than a containerized plant, for example, because the root system is so small. They typically need really frequent irrigations of just very small amounts of water. So they'll probably need a gallon of water a day, for example, for maybe even the first couple of months, and then a gradual weaning off of that. Um, so they're just more fragile, and they're typically not sold widely to the final user. These are typically sold to another nursery. So, for example, J&J might actually buy these in bulk from, say, Schmidt's nursery up in Oregon, and then they'll trim the roots like what's happening here, put them in these large containers, and then they'll grow them on for a year or maybe 2 years, and then sell them as an established plant in a pot. And that's so that they can give them that proper aftercare. And then they'll take a $20 tree and turn it into a $250 tree. And Tom, do you have anything else on that? You saw that probably more than I have.
No, I think people need to be aware of the planting depth when they buy these, and you're probably going to cover that later.
Yeah, we'll talk about planting depth, but that is critical. So these are real easy to plant. Don't plant too deep. I've for my graduate work, we actually planted 500 of these across the state, and some of the places that prepared the holes for the trees that we planted in their parks, and they used a backhoe, and so we could fit half the tree down into these holes, and really all we need is about 12 inches. So and these trees aren't like tomatoes. So tomatoes will root from the stems if you plant them too deep. Trees don't do that. They typically rot at the stems above the root line. And if they don't do that, then the root system has a hard time establishing, typically because there's less oxygen, less water, and less nutrients down deeper in the soil profile. So planting trees too deep is one of the biggest problems that we see in landscape plants, and just tree plantings in general. All right, any questions I need to field on that? I want
How
to
do you know
show
how old a tree is in a pot?
you won't. You will have no idea. You can get some idea sometimes by looking at the root system, and if but you would have no way to know, no way at all to know how long it's been in that pot.
Cut it in half, count the
Well, you can
growth
count the
rings.
rings. You can see how.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. There's a way to find out how old the tree is, right? Because we can count the annual rings, but there's no way to know how long it's been in that pot.
When I worked at J&J and we received these trees in, generally, if we were put like a number 5 or number 5 gallon pot, those would be 3 to 4 years old. And then for every pot size up, a 7-year-old tree would be a year older, number 10 tree would be a year older, 15, 20, 25. And so there was generally a year's growth between pot sizes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of the industry standard, is if they don't sell or they're trying to get them a certain size, they go up one pot industry pot size a year. But I mean, really, they don't want to keep them too long. Okay, so I wanted to show you guys how these trees are harvested. So let me share my screen with you. Let me share a different screen with you. So this is from Schmidt's nursery up in Oregon. They're one of the biggest nurseries in the United States, and they supply almost all the ornamentals to some extent that we get out here in our part of the country. Okay, I want to pause this. Okay, so you can all see he's storing that tree, right? So what I want you to notice is, okay, there's no soil on these, but I want you to notice that the root system is very broad and it's very shallow. And that's what I do want to spend some time talking about this later on. And where a big misconception with trees comes from that, oh, they're all deep rooted, they're going to root real deep. And there's so much evidence that says that in most cases, they don't root that deep at all. And you're looking at all the important roots on this tree right here that absorb the water and nutrients. You see those fine roots, they're less than 6 inches deep. And that's what we see even in the forest. You go in the forest and you look at a big tree that blew over, like you go to the redwood forest and you see a redwood forest, one of those big tall redwoods that has fallen over. And it took up half the sod in the forest around it with it. Like it just took all the young plants and everything all came up with it because those root systems are just right there near the surface, right under that organic matter layer, or sometimes even in that organic matter layer. So let me start this again. Okay, so here's a close-up of that machine. Oh, that harvester machine. So it basically has knives then that actually cut the root systems off underground. So it removes everything. All right, so planting time. So I get a question quite a bit. Is it better to plant in the spring or is it better to plant in the fall? And the answer is yes. They're both good times to plant. Early spring and fall are kind of optimal. If I only could pick one time, if I only had one time I'd pick the fall. Just simply because it can sit in the ground and we get usually enough natural precipitation to cover watering needs. And then it can actually do some rooting out in the fall and early spring as well, and kind of make that best use of that optimal moisture time in the cooler weather that reduces the transplant shock. But with balled and burlapped and container plants, you can really plant them any time during the season, anytime really the ground isn't frozen. And with bare root, we're limited to that brief window from when they're harvested dormant. They need to be planted while they're still dormant. So that's kind of the restriction on those. And you lose that window pretty quick. So, all right. Oops. So as far as planting, let's see, did I miss one? As far as planting steps, of course, we got to dig a hole. And the recommendation is to dig a hole that's 2 to 3 times wider than the container is. And no deeper than necessary. I don't recommend putting any gravel or anything in the bottom of the hole. It actually doesn't really help with drainage. It can actually inhibit drainage or make the drainage column shallow, or block the flow of water through the soil column. And then it's recommended to backfill with native soil. So whatever you took out of the hole needs to go back in the hole. And this creates a lot of concerns for people because they think, oh, I have terrible soil, so I need to amend that soil for that tree to grow better in that hole. But the reality is the roots aren't going to stay in the hole. And in fact, we need to encourage them to get out of that hole as fast as possible. And so the best way to do that is to actually get them used to the native soil straight away. And because they're going to have to deal with it the rest of their life. There's nothing about a hole that's 2 or 3 feet wide that indicates to a tree that that's all the root system it's going to have. So I mean, even a small fruit tree probably has its canopy spread 1.5 to maybe even 3 times the diameter of the crown. So if you have a 10-foot tree, 10-foot wide tree, chances are the roots are 20 to 30 feet out in the yard from that tree. And so certainly your neighbor's trees are going to be rooted in your yard and vice versa. Some trees need to be staked. The vast majority of trees that are staked do not need to be staked. They're staked because either people think they need it or because the landscape architect on a commercial site specifies it in the documentation, and so the landscape installers have to abide by that. But really, they only need to be staked if the winds are problematic, and even then, only if the tree can't really hold itself up, which can be the case of trees that are planted in the nurseries at really high densities, and they learn to support each other, and they're not used to standing alone. Or if the tree is top heavy, so some bald and burlap plants, especially the conifers, they have a lot of wind resistance, and then they have that kind of rounded root ball that can sometimes move around, and so sometimes staking is necessary, and then water it in after you're done planting, and that will settle the air pockets in the soil and get the soil in contact with the roots. So we don't recommend any fertilizers at planting. We don't recommend any root starter types of solutions at planting. There's actually no real evidence that supports the fact that they are beneficial. But there's no evidence that supports that they're harmful, but it's just an added expense that you don't necessarily have to have. And it certainly doesn't really help the tree out that we know of. And the reason we recommend not fertilizing at planting is that fertilizer tends, especially nitrogen, is going to stimulate vegetative growth. It's going to contribute to a lot of leaf development, and we don't want a lot of leaf development. We don't want to push leaf development and branch development when we don't have a root system to support it. So that root system's got to get established, and so that could take 2 to 5 years. And so putting a lot of nitrogen, at planting time can actually be harmful rather than beneficial. It can push top growth at the expense of root development and cause problems. And so,
Mike, there's a question about mycorrhizae.
Oh yeah, mycorrhiza. So the micro stuff for the root biomes. Okay, it's pretty much crap. Mycorrhizae. So mycorrhiza is a fungi they call root biome. There's all different kinds of names. There's there's a brand just called Mike. And mycorrhiza is a group of fungi that is known to infect root systems. And we might think, oh, well, that's bad. But the reality is that in a natural setting, that can be really beneficial, because as this mycorrhizae or these fungi infect roots, they actually extend their hyphae or their bodies out of the root system, and they can extend the root system into soil pores that the roots themselves can't actually reach. And so the mycorrhiza benefits the plant in water nutrient uptake, mostly nutrient uptake, and the fungus benefits because it gets food from the tree. And so then there's now all these companies out there that sell these inoculants where you can plant this mycorrhizae fungi with your trees and hopefully get this to really establish and really be great. Unfortunately, the research actually doesn't support their being beneficial to landscape and garden settings. In a native soil setting, yes, they can be very, very helpful. Like with young pine trees and stuff being put into an area where there was a clearing or a burn or something, and they might actually need it for life and death. But the real challenge with landscapes is that we manage the trees, and so even if they don't form this relationship with the fungi, they still tend to do fine because we're adding water, and usually there's plenty of nutrients around. In fact, usually we love trees too much. And then the other thing is that the research shows that the natural or the types of mycorrhiza that we buy in the stores are not native to the area in which they're going to be used, and so they typically die out. They typically don't live very long because they can't handle, like in our conditions, they can't handle the soil pH or the salt or whatever it is. They're just not native to our area. And the research also has shown that the native fungi tend to recolonize even a new landscape soil very, very rapidly. And so if there's going to be these symbiotic relationships with trees that we plant into our yards, they typically will be able to form those relationships with native fungi as those move back into the area really rapidly on their own, usually within days. That those are removing into reestablishing the soil. So they're not known to be harmful, but again, I think it's one of those areas where there's a lot of products out there. and people trying to sell you stuff that you just simply don't need. And if you think about how, like, there's been landscapers and there's been people and gardeners planting trees for hundreds of years without any of these products, and they're doing just fine. Some of those trees are, they're doing absolutely well. You can go to old gardens and see trees that are 300 or 400 years old, and they didn't have any of these products. They didn't have any fertilizers, any special fertilizers. They didn't have any special root stimulants. They didn't have any special hormones. They didn't have any special inoculants, and those trees are all doing fine. And so one size does not fit all in these cases. So I don't think they're necessary. Whew. All right, so I get asked then, why do we need to have a wide planting hole? Why can't I just dig a planting hole that's as wide as the container? Because it's a lot of work to make a planting hole that's a lot wider than the pot is. Well, this is why. This is one reason why. Is that the number one reason why we say to dig this wide, shallow hole is for compaction relief, because our soils are typically compacted where we're planting these things. So if we dig a hole that's 2 or 3 times wider, the roots can at least get established into the native soil and start having to work at getting through that soil and get a little bit of an advantage with less compaction before they have to hit the real compacted soil farther on, and hopefully they can penetrate through that. And so this is where making soil amendments or putting amendments in the planting hole. So remember how I said to just put in the dirt that came out of the hole. So if you add a bunch of potting soil and other compost and things to it and make that soil really nice, the roots can actually circle inside the hole. And that's actually what we're seeing here in this picture, is that we have a compacted soil and the roots grew around in the hole and never escaped into the native soil. You can see some examples where the roots escaped out the top of the hole into the mulch layer. That's these roots right here. Like here's a root right here, and here's another set over here that made it out through by going up and over, but they didn't actually root into the soil, they rooted into the mulch. And so these are low oxygen compacted soils, and you can see here where the roots have been deflected away from the edge of the hole back into the root ball where there's more room, where there's more oxygen and more airspace. So most of the roots really just spiral around inside the planting hole. So some of these pictures that I'm going to show you are by a researcher at the University of Florida, who actually had a really cool job looking at tree establishment, especially in hurricane regions. So did a lot of work on looking at compaction and establishment in roots. So I mentioned the staking is not usually required. It's often not needed on bald and burlapped. It's usually needed on bald and burlapped conifers and small nursery stock that was planted too closely. So I put this little picture in here. This picture can go either way. We can actually describe this picture either in a number of different ways. The picture is actually on a windy day, and this tree is actually totally fine to not be staked. And I know the caption, I put the caption on a weak stem on young tree due to high density in the nursery. This is actually good the way that this tree is bending. You see how the arc of this curve right here of the tree is a normal wind load. So that tree is absorbing the wind and shaking it off. A lot of times if we come in and we put a stake up here and we stake it right there, right about halfway up, that will distribute the wind load only on this upper part of the tree, and the trees usually break off right above where they were staked. And so if this were a picture of a tree that just was planted from a nursery and it's looking like this without it being windy, then it should be staked to help hold it upright. And it should be staked down here as low as possible, so that when the wind does blow, it can wind load like this and not break it off at the place that it was supported. But in most cases, trees really don't need to be staked in most cases where they are. So I think this is funny. You look at this and what were they thinking? So here we've got a tree that was recently planted, and it's got so these T-posts with wire and pipe to protect the trunk. And then here's a shipping. This is a dowel, a 2-inch dowel that these trees are shipped with to help support them and keep the trunks from being damaged and broken when they're shipped. And then to that was added rebar. So somebody's really worried about something happening to these trees. But what's going to happen to the health of this tree if these stakes are left on? Well, you can see right now that there is a little bit of a taper, but that for the most part, the tree is the same diameter, it's the same thickness. The trunk diameter or caliper is the same thickness as right up here at the top as it is down here where this last support tie is. That's deadly when that happens. So if and when these stakes are removed, the first windstorm that this tree experiences, it's going to snap off somewhere in this region right here, because it did not develop a taper. It has not increased its trunk strength to handle that stress. And it doesn't have to, because it's not needing to support itself, because it has these external supports to do it. And so it puts its energy somewhere else, like in top growth, rather than increasing the size of the stem. So I consulted with some landscape managers about a problem just like this a number of years ago, because they just wanted to go out and just remove the stakes outright. And I said, if you do that, you'll lose them all the first storm we have. I think they did end up losing one. But what they have to do in this case is to loosen these. So I would take off both the rebar and the wooden dowel, which should have come off at planting anyway, and loosen these so that the tree still gets some support, but it's allowed to move a little bit in the wind. And even if it only can move an inch or two, that's usually plenty, and it will establish a trunk taper and increase the strength of the trunk. And then at the most, stakes should be left on a year. Just one full season is all they need. And if they need to be left on more than that, then we usually look at root problems. There's usually some problem with root development, like compaction, waterlogged soils, those kinds of issues. Because within a year's time frame, the roots should have moved out enough that it won't need the stake anymore. So an appropriate example of staking a tree would be something loose, where it does get support if it needs it, but it otherwise can stand on its own and move a little bit in the wind when the wind blows. So this flexible kind of canvas support will do that. And you can see that this is a small tree that really would have a hard time standing up on its own. And so that's just there to support it through that first season. So the diagram kind of looks like this. So here we have a hole. Oh, do we have any questions I need to field?
Question on park strips. Somebody planted a tree that had tons of road base and extraneous material from construction. Will the tree survive?
Okay. So let me get back. I had to make an adjustment to my sound, so sorry about that. Okay, so tree planted in a mow strip with lots of construction and compaction and those kinds of issues. Is that right?
Yes.
So the answer is maybe. Typically, because the root volume in these kind of planting areas tends to be really small anyway, tree choice or tree selection is a huge part of the equation here. So it depends. I'm going to say a lot of it depends on the type of tree that's planted in that mow strip, and also how it's irrigated, and was there anything done to alleviate compaction. So overall, it's not going to matter a whole lot what tree you put in there if the soil is too compacted. And so sometimes, tilling it or doing some ripping or something in there to actually create some air movement through the soil and loosen the soil up is appropriate. So there's no way I can really answer that question without more specifics.
Yeah, they were Pacific or Norwegian sunset maples, and even if they didn't do any of that, it would still probably take 4 or 5 years for those trees to die from those conditions.
Yeah, so you're right, and so that's part of the problem is that the death isn't usually immediate, so it can be hard to actually pinpoint what what an autopsy on a tree looks like can be really difficult because typically it takes them several years in decline before we notice it. And so typically what will happen then is you just might find that the trees just sit there and they don't really look like they're getting any bigger, or their growth rates are really, really small, slow growth rates. And that's just a tree trying to balance out the environment, its growth rate, with what's available to it in the environment. So proper planting diagram looks kind of like this, where we've got this can be balled and burlap. This can be a container plant. This really can even be bare root. But you notice that the roots, the hole that was planted is rather wide. So at least twice as wide as that root ball is. And so the root collar, or the root flare, where the tree starts to flare out at the base and get a little bit wider, is above grade. And then we don't add any soil to the top of the root ball. That's really important. Number one, to keep the plants from being planted too deep, but to facilitate water movement through the top of the root ball. If we add soil to the top of the root ball, we have a different soil texture on top, and we might have a soil here that drains pretty good. But the water is going to have hard time getting through the soil on top of the root ball and into this, and it tends to just run down the edge of that root ball. So it's really important to don't put anything on top of the root ball at all. A little bit of mulch is fine, but a very thin amount. And you can see in the diagram that mulch is thinned out substantially. And then undisturbed soil at the base. So over digging a hole, if you over dig it, fill it back in and firm it very nicely. The idea here is that we don't want this root ball to settle over time and then result in the root collar here, this root flare, ending up below grade. And in our soils here, especially if they're clay and they don't drain very well, go high. It's always go high is more forgiving than going low. If you plant this root collar high, like I planted some fruit trees in my yard last year, and I planted the root ball 1 to 2 inches above that actual soil line, and I just kind of burned the soil up around it just a little bit. And that's because, number one, I have heavy soil, and number two, peach trees are really sensitive to poor draining soils. So if I have a poor draining soil, which I do, I'm gonna put it in a little bit of a hill so that I get better drainage around the top of that root ball. Okay, so there's a question: is there a way to prevent trees from growing crooked if they shouldn't be staked? If trees are growing crooked, there's lots of reasons trees can grow crooked, from damage or wind. There is not a way to keep them from growing crooked if they shouldn't be staked. There isn't. If they're growing crooked because of wind conditions or because they're on a hill, usually for wind conditions, there's nothing we can really do about that at all. And because there's no way, because that plant lives in an environment where it's always going to be having that kind of stress, it will grow crooked, and it will adjust to that and produce reaction wood to strengthen it. But the trees may not grow with a really straight trunk, and there is no way that can be addressed through some mechanical device to straighten the tree up, unless you build a permanent windbreak. So the photo of proper staking: how far from the ground should the band be attached? Okay, that's a great question, and maybe I can go back. So what this picture doesn't show, and one thing that you really have to be aware of, is this is a great picture, but we don't see what's going on the root ball. This stake, the metal stake or whatever stake you use, has to be in ground that is not part of the root ball. And that's because the root system and the tree and everything is all going to move together. And so it does. If you put a stake in with it, then the stake is just going to move with the tree in the wind, and it's not going to be giving it support. So the stake has to go out into the ground. If we look at like this picture right here, we would not want to put a stake in any of this area here. The stake would have to go in out here where it can get into undisturbed soil, or at least out of the root ball where it will have a chance to support the root ball. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about irrigation. Overwatering is the main culprit. Overwatering really is we kind of attribute about 80% of our landscape problems to irrigation management. And then most of those problems are related to too much water going on. And so watering deeply and infrequently is the message we also send out for watering lawns, but this is also where we need to get for watering trees and shrubs too. Roots will be where the water is. Typically we want to check, make sure that the soil is dried down a few inches before watering, and consider the season. If it's going into fall, winter time, we don't care. Usually there's enough moisture there, unless it's a conifer, then we may need to drag a hose out there and water. I've watered plants into the fall, even into November, even into Thanksgiving if we have a dry fall. Um, so what is deep? What is deep? We want to do a deep, infrequent irrigation. And I have to preface this. This is after the trees have been established. If you've got a new tree, you may need to water it weekly or maybe even daily for a while, for the first few weeks or maybe even the first few months that it's been planted, and then you should start being able to back that off. So last year I planted a couple of new stone fruits, as I mentioned, in my yard. We watered them every day for a while. This year I don't expect to have to water them really that much differently than the peach tree that I've had in my yard for about 6 or 7 years, because the root systems now have moved out into the native soil. So deeply, we're typically shooting for about a 12-inch depth. That's generally speaking where we're going to hit most of the roots. And as I mentioned, the root systems really aren't going to be doing a lot of uptake in areas deeper than that. If you had a really sandy or really gravelly or rocky soil where it was better air and there was better drainage, the roots might be deeper than that. But by and large, they're still not going to be really that much deeper. And there might be roots that go deeper than that. For example, some trees will produce roots that grow at these oblique angles. They don't really have much of a function in water and nutrient uptake. They're more of a stability function. And so we don't try and target those kind of roots typically when we're irrigating. So another big misconception is that, and it's this related to this bullet right here, roots will be where the water is. There's a common misconception that roots will grow through dry soil looking for moist soil, and that is absolutely untrue. Roots cannot grow through dry soil. They don't grow into dry soil. There has to be enough water in the soil that will actually allow the root to grow there. It's kind of a lubrication issue. And so they don't grow through dry soil thinking, oh, if I can just make it 3 more feet, there's got to be water on the other side of that. That's not how they function. They will be in soil that is moist, and if there are large dry gaps in soil, too dry for them to pass through, then roots won't grow into that area, and that's pretty much as simple as it is. So if the water is close to the tree, if you're applying water close to where the tree is, roots aren't necessarily they may not get that water unless there's a way to bridge that dry area. So as far as mulch around the trunk of the tree, you can mulch over the root ball. Don't bury the trunk, and we typically say don't let mulch touch the trunk of the tree. And that's in this picture. You can kind of see the mulch thins out as we get to the top of the tree. The reason for that is that mulch holds a lot of moisture, and we don't want to have a lot of soggy moisture right at the base of the tree, which can encourage crown rot right there where that root flare is. So we look at a picture like this where the soil isn't drained very well, and I think there's no way we can grow trees here. This is a mow strip, and it's obviously been really compacted. So the trick is, though, when was this picture taken, and when was the water even? When was this rain? If that hole filled with water and it's still got water like this in it after, say, about 24 hours, then this is generally going to be unsuitable for plant growth, especially trees. If that much water drains out of the hole within about 24 hours, it's probably okay to plant to plant trees in it, honestly, as long as that soil drains out. So soils that get really full of water, that's okay. That's okay. That soil can get totally filled up and even saturated with water as long as it's a brief, um, irregular event. So as long as the soil drains and the oxygen can move back into that zone, then we're okay. Then the plants will be okay. And if they tend to stay really, really wet, then just move your tree selection to trees that can handle really, really wet. Okay, I mentioned this already. Uh, don't fertilize trees at planting, and in most cases, our landscape trees don't need any special fertilizer anyway, because if they're growing near a lawn and you fertilize the lawn, then they're going to get plenty of fertilizer from that. The roots will be out there with the lawn, competing with the lawn. Typically, on fruit trees, a lot of times we will fertilize fruit trees because we're after a certain amount of production from those, and we're actually going to remove nitrogen from the system by harvesting the fruit. So sometimes a periodic fertilizer for them might be necessary, and certainly the commercial growers fertilize every year, but they're able to measure that harvest and correlate harvest with fertilizer load. But typically in the landscape garden situation, wait at least a year for each inch of trunk diameter before you fertilize. So let it work out on its own before we start stimulating leaf growth and top growth. We want to make sure that the root system has had a chance to get some size to it. All right. So any questions before we shift gears?
There's a quick one about trees planted in lawn, what irrigation pattern should be followed so that the trees can stay as healthy as possible.
Okay. So typically in lawns, if we follow sound management or best management practices for irrigating lawns, usually the trees will be okay. What I recommend is to move the grass, get the grass away from the base of the tree as much as possible. We just call it a tree well or a tree ring, and where the lawn is removed around the base of the tree. And that's mostly just to keep the equipment away from the base of the tree. And then secondly is to irrigate. If we irrigate our lawns deeply and infrequently, so in the summer that might be a couple days a week, and we're shooting for an 8 to 12 inch depth with our lawns, which is what we should be shooting for. That's usually also suitable for trees. So when we overwater our lawns and then stick a tree in it and then we overwater the trees, the reality is that there's no way that we can irrigate the trees differently if they're in a lawn setting, because the roots are going to be out in the lawn, so they're going to be experiencing whatever we're giving the lawn. So as long as we're watering the lawn, and when we water it real thoroughly and get it good and moist all the way through the profile, and then let the soil dry out again between irrigations, that is a healthy scenario.
Okay, one other question on correct watering schedules, and I'm going to add this for newly planted trees and established trees.
So like I said, for newly planted trees, for a while it's probably going to be every day, especially in the summer. And then you just kind of have to back it off as they get more established. What I've seen and what the general rule of thumb is, and I already told you the general rule of thumb is, the establishment, it's usually a year for every inch of trunk diameter. So if you buy a small conifer, or excuse me, a small fruit tree, let's say an inch caliper, the general rule of thumb is it takes a year for that to establish, and then that second year it'll start to grow at the rate it was growing before. What I've personally seen in our area is that it tends to take trees longer than that to reestablish, and it just has to do mostly with the stressful situations that we grow under. So I typically double that time, and in some cases, like I've planted larger caliper stuff. I planted a 3-inch caliper tree about 6 or 7 years ago, and last year was the first year it looked like it really had started to overcome the transplanting. So it's basically taking about 2 years per inch. So
there's another question on how long to run the hose or drip, And I'll just go ahead and let you field that one.
Yeah, those are hard ones, and we talk a little bit more about irrigation as it relates to turf because that covers some of this too. But we can't answer those questions very well because just off the cuff, because we don't know any conditions about your site. So if I will give you some generals though, real quick. If I have a heavy soil, then like my yard is a clay loam. Okay, so I can usually get away with watering with my drip irrigation about 90 minutes. Um, for my landscape about once a week. If I'm growing in very sandy soil, I usually could do just fine. So like it may be in a raised bed where I have really well draining soil. It might be 15 or 20 minutes 3 times a week because the water's not going to stay in the soil. The sandy soil, just the water just moves right through it. But in the heavier soils, most of that water gets stored in the soil, and then I go a longer period of time from when I irrigate to let it dry back out. But it takes more water to fill up that clay soil. So I leave it on longer, but I don't run it as often. That's the general rule of thumb. And that's about as specific as I can get without like actually knowing real specifics about the soil type and the type of irrigation system and how far the emitters are spaced apart and all those kinds of things. Woody plants are amazing, and they produce over time. They produce what's called reaction wood, and this is basically like in people, this would be like muscles. So over time, where they're experiencing stress, over time they actually put growth into those areas to strengthen it. And in some cases, that actually I'm a certified tree risk assessor with the ISA. And that's actually one way we can actually look and see if a tree is actually structurally compromised is if it starts putting a lot of extra growth in one area. That could mean that tree is about to fail in a certain area because it's trying really hard to compensate for some decay or some other stress. But this muscle wood is called reaction wood. And in conifer plants, it's produced on the opposite side of the stress, and it's called compression wood. So that's basically basically bracing it, keeping it from being compressed. And in broadleaf plants or angiosperms, or those that have a hard seed coat, it's produced on the side facing the stress, and it's called tension wood. So the way that this would work is if it was a conifer and a branch is sticking out on a conifer, maybe we can just go to this picture here. If you put your arm out and a conifer is actually going to build muscle or wood underneath the branch to prop it up. And say an ash tree is gonna build muscle on the top to keep it from being pulled down. So they just have two different ways of dealing with it. But this is a spruce tree that was growing in Sweden, that was grown in a swamp, and it is actually growing tilted like this. And they noticed that on the downhill side of the tree, where it was experiencing that pull of gravity trying to pull it over, it actually produced all this extra wood. So you can see there's the kind of the biological center of the tree, but it produced more growth on these rings over the years to make that side stronger so that it wouldn't break when it was leaning. Here's a hardwood tree, and here's the biological center of that, and here's this huge muscle. It's like a big bicep muscle that's resisting that being pulled down. And here's a picture of a great big oak tree, and you can see this huge muscle right here that's strengthening, keeping this big old branch out here from falling off. And so these are the kind of branches that you want to hang the tire swing from, because they have these huge reaction wood areas to get the gravitational stress dealt with. So when the anatomy of tree is such that we typically call the part where all the branches are the crown, then we have the trunk, and then we have the root collar or the root flare. Now the root collar is where the actual kind of tissue from the roots and the tissue from the stems overlap, and it creates kind of a bulge sometimes, or wrinkles. And the root flare is this, you can see the buttressing effect that is made at the base of this tree, where it goes into the ground. That's the root flare. And that's what we're typically looking for when we say, don't plant a tree too deep. What we're looking for is where's that root flare? Or if it's a young tree and hasn't developed flare yet, we look at where do the roots start. So that's how we know where it's planted, whether or not it's planted too deep. And sometimes that's a case in the nursery where they'll come planted too deep in a pot. And that's because they will put them in a bigger pot year after year. And the pots get deeper and they just keep burying the trunk of the tree in the pot. And so sometimes we need to go and excavate. And some of the trees that I've planted, I've excavated like half of the soil off of the root ball, like out of the container, before I actually find the root flare. And so I then plant that without that soil on top. I've excavated all that soil off the top so that I can see this root flare. Because trees don't adapt well. They don't have good mechanisms to deal with the root system being planted deeper than where it wants to have the root system. So as root systems, some trees do develop tap roots. Tap roots typically develop from the seed. And so plants that have been harvested and put in your yard don't have a tap root, and they won't regrow a tap root either. They're typically just coming from plants that are planted from seeds, and so you won't really have to deal with that unless you plant them on your own from seed. Fibrous roots are the ones that are typically the most important in the sense that they're the ones where the water and nutrients are taken up, and most of those are in the top 6 inches of soil. So this is some more pictures from Ed Gillen that I mentioned before from University of Florida. They excavated about a 6-foot portion here around the base of this tree. And you can see the root flare. This young plant is developing nicely. But these long fibrous roots grow in the upper soil layers for great distances. And you can see where there were stones here that deflected the roots, but then the roots quickly try to reorient around those stones and grow as straight away from the base of the tree as they can. You can see that here the root was deflected here, but it changed direction and went around it, but it's still in a direction that's very much away from the center of the tree. And you can see all those fibrous roots there that were left. So they're only in about the top 6 inches or so. And this is in a sandy soil in Florida. So here's some red maples planted in a row right here. These have been in the ground 2 years, and this is also in Florida. And where this man is standing, from this tree right here, the root system is out that far. So that's 2 to 3 times the width of the canopy of that tree is how far those roots have made it. So, so you might say, well, that's Florida, so Florida grows things better. Well, yeah, it grows things faster, but we'll still experience the same root spread in a similar tree. It just might take 3 years instead of 2. Does that make sense? So the roots still genetically are going to want to be out there. And I think this one's quite interesting here. So these oak trees have been in the ground a year, and they actually excavated the roots and painted some of them white. And you can see this root right here. It's not very deep, but the roots are out here to where these people are standing. So a full canopy width plus extra. So 1.5 to 2 times the canopy width just in the first growing season alone. And so this is why I say, if your trees are growing anywhere near your garden or near your grass, those trees, if they're more than a year old, are probably rooted out into the grass and are taking their water and nutrients up from the grass. And so, yeah, there might be an irrigation system here like there is at the base of the tree. But if you're irrigating this lawn out here where these people are standing, the tree is going to get most of its water from the lawn, and the drip system might in some cases just be completely useless. So roots quickly spread outside the canopy edge, or what we commonly call the drip line. Sometimes you'll see fertilizer recommendations or pesticide applications that say apply this product to the drip line. But we know that really the roots spread much farther than that. So roots commonly extend 2 to 3 times the drip line, and this means if a tree crown is 10 feet wide, the roots can be found out 20 to 30 feet, sometimes farther. Some of the research that I looked at a few years ago on this They were actually finding that with some plants, the roots were actually spread out 7 times the canopy width. So they're really spreading out there. And in a forest setting, there were some research that they did on looking at root spread in a forest setting. They were finding that the roots of one large conifer tree could spread as far as an acre. They could cover it, and or excuse me, up to 4 acres of ground. Those roots had spread out over about 4 acres. And then they were, of course, interwoven and sharing that space with all their neighboring trees who also occupy that much space. So just not to leave out shrubs, but shrubs are kind of experiencing the same thing. So here's a pittosporum. So this is also Florida. This is in a tree that grows here because it's not hardy enough. But you can look at that fibrous root system. It's only about 8 inches deep, and this is a sandy soil. So where people say, well, if you have sandy soil, the roots can be deeper. They could be, but that's not where they prefer to be because the oxygen content is better up close. The water content's better up close. The nutrient content's better up near the surface, and the microbial activity is better up near the surface. And so typically that's why we say most everything's going to be in that top foot, and a lot of that water and nutrient uptake is going to be even a little bit shallower than that in most cases. And certainly if it's compacted soil, you'll find that they're even way closer to the surface, sometimes even right on the surface. So I just wanted to kind of play out here the kind of some of the most common problems that we see with putting woody plants in the ground, just generally speaking. Number one is planting too deep promotes root system depletion of oxygen and trunk decay. So you can see here in this picture, this soil line right where the thumb is here is where that tree was in the pot. Okay, you can see the root flare right here. You can see this nice buttressing out at the base. That's what we want to see. So the potting soil was excavated out off of this tree to about 5 inches before we actually found the top of where the root system really had originated, and then we want to go back and plant to that area. And this is a little Zelkova that was planted, and you can see that because I can see the Zelkova leaves all around it right there. All right, here's another example here. Here's I think a green ash tree planted too deep. And the way that I know that it's planted too deep is you can see the tree goes in the ground, looks like a post, straight all the way into the ground. You don't see any root flare. That's a dead giveaway. You can go to any park and you can look and see what trees were planted too deep because they'll look like a post going into the ground. Here, the shovel is this shovel is about a foot tall right here, the head of the shovel. And down about where the shovel is stuck into the ground is about where the root flare really started. And so that tree was planted more than a foot deep. And those kind of problems can lead to roots trying to move up out of the soil profile closer to the surface. And then in this case, a lot of times that leads to girdling roots, and we can see that here, these surface girdling roots, which can cause additional problems. Here's a small conifer. You can see it actually decayed and broke off. Here's where the soil line was, where it was planted, and here's where it broke off, and that actually even broke off above the root flare. So that was probably a good 2 feet, maybe more, planted too deep in the ground. And there's just no way that it's going to be able to survive that. So if you've ever seen a tree in the ground that's been planted, it's been there a few years, and the tree is still wobbly, it was planted too deep because the root system is trying to grow up and get out of that waterlogged, oxygen-deprived environment. So it will never create a tight bonding situation with the soil when you have slack in the roots like that. So girdling roots, circling roots, this can be caused by trees grown in containers for too long, and sometimes it can take years to see the problem. You can see this here. So one of the problems in containers, as I mentioned, is that the roots grow around in circles in the pot. And on woody plants, that's particularly a problem as the plants get older, because some of those roots will turn into structural roots, and they'll want to become woody, and they'll become more like branches in that sense. So as they get bigger in diameter every year, and the trunk gets bigger in diameter every year, eventually they start to conflict with each other. And you can see that's the case here, where this root now is acting like a rope, and you can see that it is cut into the growing part of the trunk. It's cut into the phloem and is going to cause problems with the root system. So this is why we say, hey, on woody plants, you need to go through and you need to cut through that root ball and eliminate those circling roots and get new roots to form where they'll grow straight out away from the tree instead of they'll continue to go around in this circle. So here's another tree where we see these roots coming to the surface and then going around it and keeping it from the trunk from elongating or getting bigger in diameter. It's like leaving twine on too long. Packing materials is another big issue here. You can see this string was left on, so you see how the trunk is very swollen above it. That's a backup. That's like a big accident on the highway, and here we have the traffic is backed up. So all the nutrients and hormones that the plant was sending down to the root system have been backed up, and what usually happens here is the root system starves to death. So this is non-degradable twine issues, nursery tags, wire baskets, burlap, those kinds of things. So here's a little plant that had some twine on it. You can still see the burlap right here. So somebody asked the question earlier, how do you properly plant ball and burlap stuff? And if you look at arborists and their recommendations and even research professionals, there's no one common consensus amongst everybody as to what should happen. But here's generally what's considered best practice. Remove as much wire and burlap as you can and all of the twine. That's really kind of the bottom line here is you've got your ball and burlap plant. It's in its wire basket. It's in its burlap. It's got the twine around it, holding it all together. You've dug the hole the appropriate size. You move the plant into the hole, and then you remove the packing materials after it's in the hole. Because if you try and move it into the hole after you've taken off the burlap and the wire, a lot of times the root system falls apart. So move it into the hole. And then what I do with these is I just have some big bolt cutters or lock cutters, and I go down and I cut all the wire off as far down in the hole as I can. And if I can't remove it completely, I cut through it and leave spaces so that roots can push it out of the way if they get that big. Those wire baskets do not decay fast enough to allow the roots. If the roots get big enough, they will be damaged or inhibited by the wire basket. So you need to cut it off as much as possible and remove
Mike,
as much of the burlap as possible. Yes, question.
Question on cutting away girdling roots from the tree.
Okay, so like if we go back and look at this or this, if we want to remove those. So a root like this one right here, I would remove. I'd cut it off here at the base where it goes into the ground, and I'd find out where it goes around the tree on the other side, and I would cut it also off there. So I actually cut a section of the rope out completely because this root's not structural. It's different with this one. If I go in and start chopping these roots off, these roots are large enough at this point that they're structural, and it could cause the tree to be unstable. So this is just unfortunate, but there's really not any corrective action that one could really take at this point. And feel free to unmute your mics and ask a question, you guys, or ask me to clarify if I haven't addressed the issue the way that you intended. So back to the removing the packing material, just remove as much as possible.
So Mike?
Yeah, Amy?
Hey, so if you do have a tree that's planted too low, but it's been there for a couple years, what's the you can't elevate it, so you just keep the dirt off it so it's almost kind of sunken down a little bit, or what's the best thing
you might
to
be
do
surprised. You might be able to raise it if it's only been in the ground a couple of years, partly because, especially if it was planted too deep and it's quite substantially too deep, you'll probably find that the root system hasn't established that well. And so you may actually be able to go out away from it and just cut down into it and raise it up. You may not have to like unplant the whole thing, but just raise it up and kind of push some dirt and stuff underneath it. It's quite a bit of work, but you may find that if it's only been a year or two, you might still be able to raise it. And long term, that's actually what I would recommend. If that's at all possible, that is by far the best scenario.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and removing soil from the surface out as far as you can would be the next best scenario, like trying to move it down closer to that root ball or where that root flare is. But then
Uh-huh.
you have to keep in mind that you might also create this area where water is going to collect, which could cause additional problems. So as long as the soil drains well or has a way to get out of that low spot, like through a channel or maybe through a little drain or something you put in the back of it, that would be the next best thing. But I think you'd be surprised that your success being able to do it, because the trees will just recover, especially if you do it now while the trees are still dormant. They'll go out and they'll auto adjust for the growing season, and you probably won't really notice that much of an effect.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Mhm. Another big common problem we see is trunk injuries from string trimmers, or in this case, this is winter sun injury. You see there's some bleaching here, and there's this crack, and this is why fruit trees are painted white, and why young trees especially, we recommend putting on some sort of a white reflective wrap or paint or something to keep the winter sun off of them. Um, as that south side, we also call it southwest winter injury, because it happens on the southwest side where the sun is the strongest, where the bark underneath that part of the tree comes out of dormancy. Um, Sap starts to flow, then temperatures quickly return to freezing, like at nighttime or in another cold weather event, and it kills the cambium under that side of the tree. And then as the living part of the tree on the north side starts to grow, it creates a separation line between the dead tissue and the living tissue. And so this is particularly, the winter sun injury is particularly a problem on dark, thin barked trees, which includes all the fruit trees and all of their ornamental counterparts. So flowering cherries, flowering plums, all of those are dark with a thin bark. Cherry trees are especially prone to this. And ornamental cherries, it seems like even more so than the fruiting cherries. So string trimmer damage. This is why I say, get a tree well, excavate the grass out away from the base of the tree. It does help the tree competition wise a little bit, but really what it does is it keeps us away with our equipment. You can see the damage that's done to that, and we think there's just a few little blades of grass right here. I'm really good with a string trimmer. I can get it without hitting the bark, and you can't. So it just doesn't work that way. You can see that doesn't happen. And so what is the ultimate problem for the tree is that decay gets in there, obviously, but because this part of the freeway now is experiencing a complete failure, the root system is what ultimately suffers, because it now can't get food from the top of the tree. We block that highway, and so the root system starts to die back, and then we start to see dieback in the top of the tree, and we may not notice that dieback for 2 or 3 years. And then we see that dieback and get all alarmed, and now there's borers and there's other issues. And really what it came down to was we were too heavy with the string trimmer a few years ago, and that caused problems down the road. And we don't see the problem. You won't see problems from the string trimmer in the first year. You won't see problems from this damage the first year, and maybe not even the second year, even though the tree will start to experience symptoms. We just don't notice it before then. And 5 years down the road, we look down the line and we think, oh man, that tree is only half the size of the others, or is a third shorter than the others. Why? And we think that there's a problem at that point, but the problem was 5 years ago. So irrigation issues, we've talked about that. This is a tree here. This is a tree in drought stress, but it's from overwatering. It's actually from being in a waterlogged soil, which creates an anaerobic condition for the roots. So they're living in an oxygen deprived environment. So they actually start to die and they reduce their function. And so they can't take water. And so the trees start to get these what looks like they're not getting enough water. And they're not getting enough water. But it's because the plant can't take it up, because the root system is dying, versus the fact that the soil is just really dry and there's no water to take up. So we get in our canoe and we paddle over there and look at it and think that tree needs more water. And we want to put more water on it, which then causes the problem to be even worse. So too much water and too little water will show pretty much the same symptoms. They'll wilt and you'll get dry leaves. Poor planting sites. Landscape architects still love to do this, where they have these small islands and they put trees in them, because It looks good on paper, but it doesn't look good in reality. But parking lots, parking strips, power lines, I see large trees planted close to homes all the time, especially in these new developments, model homes where they showcase all these great features, and they put great big Atlas cedars right on the base of the tree. And you think, that's a 100-foot tree. How's that going to work out when it's 3 feet away from the foundation of that house? So you have to, those things matter in the long term. So, here's an unfortunate situation here. This is in Logan. Here's like a 2-foot mow strip with a honey locust tree in it. Now that's a 40-foot tree and a 2-foot mow strip. And that's not going to work out. Power line issues. So it comes down to putting the right tree in the right place. Here, this was a volunteer tree that blew in there, and the homeowner allowed to just grow. So is that going to cause problems? Absolutely, it is. Topping trees, improper pruning. I don't need to spend more time on that, but I just want to. This is just a graphic that I made a long time ago in graduate school, actually, that just kind of illustrates the mortality spiral that we see with plants, with woody plants. So we have a mature plant, or a plant that is growing well and is healthy, but then it's subjected to drought or air pollution or herbicide damage or saline soils, or maybe all of these things in a landscape. So that then puts it in a position where it's predisposed to have injury or have some sort of problems. And then we might actually push it further by construction damage or irrigation management problems or compacted soils. All of these are realistic for a landscape situation. And then we might actually end up with a tree being injured then. So it's got actually some physical ailment or some physical damage that's happened to it. And then we might see a little bit of dieback, but it's not too alarming. And usually at this point, we might actually start to increase watering a little bit, thinking that it just needs more water. And then this is when we start to see the bark beetles and root rot and stem decay actually moving in. And it's because we moved from a healthy plant through all these conditions now to a plant that's unhealthy, and that allows its defenses, or causes its defenses to be weakened, which then allows other organisms to get in there. So we're all well aware this time of COVID-19 and the problems that it's causing, and it tends to be affecting people most that already have immune system challenges through other health challenges. And trees are no different. When they're exposed to other health challenges and their immune systems might be compromised, that lets other organisms move in that the tree wouldn't normally have a problem with. And so most bark beetles, most borers, most of those kind of insect problems are related to the tree being stressed out from pre-existing conditions. But most people will notice then that they start to see bark beetles, and then they call me and then they say, well, what can I spray on this tree to kill the bark beetles? And the answer is really nothing, but they're also not really the problem. They're a visible sign of a pre-existing problem, but they aren't the underlying problem. And so we go back and I do a tree autopsy or a triage or something with it, and I go back and look at what happened, and then the homeowner eventually remembers that 5 or 6 years ago they rebuilt the driveway and they cut half of the existing root system off of the tree, and now there's a lot of dead wood, and now they have borers. And so it's like, well, we can't really fix that. You might just want to start over with a new tree that won't hopefully have that kind of stress in its life. But it's right about here that most people start to notice that there's a problem, and that's when they call a professional in. And at that point in time, there's not much that a professional can do, because all this has been happening for the previous 10 years. So the bottom line is that improper cultural practices lead to stressed trees, and those are more susceptible to insect infestations, diseases, and death. And so why is it that stress causes immune systems to be weakened? In the case of trees, it's because the compounds that plants create, the defense compounds, their repair compounds, and the things that they use to fend off attack, they require a lot of energy to manufacture. And when the plant becomes stressed out, it stops slowing down the manufacture of those real expensive components to keep the more basic systems alive. And that's what then allows other organisms to move in there, is because it doesn't have the frontline defenses as robust as they used to be. All right, so this is just a list of what I think are typical landscape losers, or ones that I would seriously consider planting other options in place of these. Overall, the willows, the poplars, the quaking aspens, the green ash, black locust, tree of heaven, which I think was named as a joke, Siberian elm, Russian olive, and then blue spruce with a question mark. So all of these are trees that are either illegal to plant in the case of Russian elm or Russian olive, or grow fast and have problems with lots of wood falling off all the time. So, and quaking aspen is a problem because it's disease prone and because it suckers profusely throughout your yard and everybody else's yard. Um, blue spruce. Blue spruce is just an interesting one. There's a lot of new ones out there now in the spruce category that are a lot more dwarfing. But I mean, you look at these huge, huge trees, and then what tends to be real problematic with them is that they do this. And so while they're adapted well to landscapes, they tend to perform pretty well in landscapes. They tend also to have a huge wind resistance in that big sail of a canopy they have, and they tend to blow over in landscapes. So you can see in this case here, that root system was not very deep. It just took about 4 inches off, just took the sod up. And you look at a tree that big, but this rooting area is really small. So this is natural. This is how they are in the forest too. They're not deeply rooted. They spread that root system over, though, an acre, and it can distribute the wind load across that. But where it's confined to a small landscape area, these big trees just really don't have a place, a sustainable place in these landscapes. So in this case, hopefully, most of these tip over fairly slowly, and so they may not actually crash through the roof of your house, but still very problematic. And it seems like most years we get a really good windstorm. I know in Kaysville a few years ago they had a really high windstorm, and in the news there, everybody that had a blue spruce, it blew over just like this. So I want to take a few minutes and go over some of the common trees that we typically see here in the Intermountain West in Utah. And most of them are trees that we recommend, that I like personally. I'll make a few notes to maybe some others as well. So this is just some common selected trees that we think should be planted more, and usually provide good landscape success here. So first is beech, Fagus sylvatica. This is actually European beech. It's hardy to zone 4. These are large trees, slow growing, beautiful. It's one of my favorite trees as far as just the overall look. The bark on these trees look like it's been poured on, like warm chocolate. The full sun, there's quite a few different forms of these. There's tricolor, for example, which we'll talk about in just a second. There's these weeping forms. They tend to have a very dark green leaf, with the exception of the tricolor beech, which is pictured here on the right, which has the pink and white margins as well as the green leaves. So these are good if they're planted in an area that gets afternoon shade, especially because in the summer those pink and white margins tend to actually dry up, and the leaves can look really tattered and ragged pretty early on in the season. And on the left is a purple variety, a purple beech, still European beech, Fagus sylvatica, but a purple variety. So there's a lot of different cultivars out there in form, leaf color, and shape. And they're a lot of fun. They are prone to some piercing, sucking insects like aphids and scale, but we don't see a lot of that typically here. Big tooth maple is one of the 2 native maples to Utah, Acer grandidentatum. The other one is Rocky Mountain maple, which we don't have nearly as much of in Utah. So the big tooth maple is the one that we typically see in the hills, the mountains, turning this red and orange and yellow in the fall. It's very, very winter hardy, small to medium tree, usually on the smaller side. Grows fairly slowly. Good for dry locations. Larry Rupp, who just retired at Utah State University recently, spent a lot of his career actually selecting and evaluating big tooth maple cultivars for Utah. One cultivar, if you can find it, would be Rocky Mountain Glow. Has a nice fall color.
This particular tree doesn't necessarily do well in the valleys, so it is native here and it's very hardy, but it is native to areas that have more moist soils and less kind of sidewalk, pavement, asphalt heat. So it's something to try, but it still may not be the best replacement maple for some landscapes. But there's a picture of the fall color. It's beautiful. Bur oak, or Quercus macrocarpa. So bur oak is one of about 3 main oaks that are in really what's called the white oak group of oaks. And these are oaks that have rounded lobes on the leaves without a sharp spine or a sharp point on any of the leaves. Bur oak is so named for the cap that goes over the nut. It's also called mossy cup oak. You can see the cap in some cases can almost completely enclose the nut. But as a group, the white oaks, and bur oak being a major player here in Utah, tolerate the high pH soils extremely well. And the Gamble oak that grows native in Utah's mountains is in the white oak group as well. And it's very, very well adapted to Utah. They're also typically fairly fast growing, large pest-free trees. The bur oak is probably one of the best adapted for Utah, although there is another one called swamp oak, which is also a great tree. And then English oak also does well here in Utah. And then of course Gamble oak, which can actually make a nice landscape plant, albeit much smaller than any of these other types of oaks. Common alder. Alder is one we don't see a lot of, but is a great large tree, medium to large tree for wet soils, or soils that tend to stay a little bit soggy or dry out much more slowly. Its native environment is along bottomlands and areas where there's lots of water. It grows fairly quick, kind of gives a soft texture to the landscape, and it really doesn't have a whole lot of pests to it. I don't see this much in landscapes, but certainly it has a place in a wetter location. Common choke cherry, Prunus virginiana. This is the tree that we see a lot of flowering in the spring, and typically flowers around the time that most of the ornamental pears are flowering, and a lot of the crab apples as well. They do have a cultivar. Well, in fact, most of them pretty much all get red foliage. The foliage comes out green, as you can kind of see in the little inset picture here. Foliage comes out green, and then as it ages, it turns to this red foliage. And that's pretty typical for the species. Small trees, good for under power lines. The fruit is edible, but the leaves are toxic. You should consume any of the rest of the plant. One of the biggest disadvantages of this plant is that it does sucker profusely, sends up shoots from the root system. You can see here in the little picture at the bottom, lots and lots of suckers coming up at the base of that. Those can overwhelm the rest of the tree and make it look very unsightly, or more like a tall shrub instead of a small tree. And it really does look best and perform its best if those are removed and it's just kept the training to a central trunk, just one trunk. Schubert and Canada Red. Canada Red really is probably the main cultivar here, but does have a really nice red leaf color to it. Northern red oak, Quercus rubra. So northern red oak is, as I mentioned earlier, there's the white oak group, and now we're talking about an oak in the red oak group. And as a general rule, the red oak group of oaks does not do well in the high pH soils that we have in the Intermountain West. Northern red oak does well. I've seen really nice trees here in Utah if the soil drains well. It needs good drainage, but is a very strongly branched, at least when it's young, it's very pyramidal. And then as it ages, it tends to round out a little bit, but lovely, kind of that red orange fall color, slow growing, very large trees, good for a large landscape, a large lawn or a park, but it's got to have drainage. in order to keep from being iron chlorotic with the high soil pHs that we typically have here. There's others too. There's Texas red oak, which again can do okay here. And I've seen it do okay in areas that have pretty sharp drainage. So a steep slope, gravelly soil, those kinds of things, sandy soil, and it will do okay. Columnar English oak, or Quercus robur fastigiata. These are hardy oaks, again, an oak in the white oak group. There's the columnar version of this, which is what's pictured here. And then there is the species, which is a very broad branched, tall, large tree that you can imagine is what's mostly going to be seen in the country, in the hillsides in Europe, is English oak. They can live for many centuries in the right landscape. So it grows medium fast. It's not super slow, but it's certainly not fast like poplars. A couple of things with this: it's good for a small space. They'll typically round out with maturity. They can be anywhere 40 or 50 feet high or higher, with a base maybe 15 feet wide. A couple of things about it is that the leaves stay on the tree in the winter, especially towards the center of the plant. That is, the leaves that form in the juvenile portion of the tree tend to not fall off in the winter. It's just called juvenile leaf retention. And they get pushed off by the new growth in the spring typically. So sometimes it can be unsightly, and that's just something to kind of consider if you're choosing a tree like this. And then you can also see in this picture at the top, one of the branches is these grow long branches that just grow very much upright. And as they age, and sometimes with some snowstorms getting on them, those branches will peel away or start to get pulled down, and they don't usually go back up. So they can become pretty unsightly and even have some branch breakage as they get older. With pruning, of course, some of that can be corrected, but you can imagine that a tree that's 40 or 50 feet tall, you're going to have to probably get a pretty serious lift in order to get up there, and then understand also the technique that's needed to train them. So just understand that may happen as the trees get a little older. So crabapple is a very small tree. Lots of cultivars out there, hundreds of cultivars out there. Very cold hardy. The varieties that we typically see in the marketplace today and in the last couple of decades are persistent fruited, which means the fruits stay on in the winter, and birds usually pick them off, or they dry and are really a nuisance, like the older crab apples with much larger fruit. They're kind of an all-season tree. A lot of people like them because of the early spring flowers, but then they tend to have a nice soft green landscape look most of the rest of the season, and then the fruit is oftentimes very attractive. They're all pretty much going to bear fruit, except one cultivar, Spring Snow, is completely fruitless. It is a white flower and has sterile flowers. Coral Burst is another popular one, but there really are a lot out there. You just head to the nurseries and see what they've got. European hornbeam, or Carpinus betulus. This is a very hardy pyramidal tree. So I've recommended this in the past as a replacement for the English oak, as it tends to not have the branch separation or the branch peeling down quite as bad as the English oak. It does tend to broaden out much more than the oaks do. Typically, as they're maturing out, they'll get maybe 20 to 30 feet at the base. So maybe is twice as large as the English oaks, but still very upright in youth. And then as it gets older, they become more rounded and more oval. So it's used often as a screen. It is prone to some leaf scorch here in Utah because it is not native to areas where there's a lot of dry air, so low humidity. But it is a lot more shade tolerant and high pH tolerant than the oak. Flowering pear, or just Pyrus. There's two. Well, okay, let me back up. Flowering pear is a pretty hardy, medium-sized tree. It's an all-season tree in that it does flower in the spring and has typically nice red fall color. It is prone to fire blight, which is a problem with anything in the rose family. And flowering pears are in the rose family, as are regular pears and apples and roses and a few others. So it is prone to fire blight, which is a bacterial disease that affects members of the rose family. And in recent years, I've seen trees, a lot of flowering pears damaged severely from this bacterial infection. So we used to recommend this a lot. I don't recommend it that much anymore because it was kind of overplanted. They tend to have about a 20-year life cycle in most landscapes. Certainly there are older ones, but typically once they hit about 20 years, they kind of disintegrate and start to die back. And there's just other trees that we can use out there that I think will give us the same value, but with fewer problems. They also tend to have really, really narrow branch angles, and they tend to kind of self-destruct as they get older. So ginkgo, or Ginkgo biloba. So ginkgo is a very hardy tree that is, we can find evidence of this in the fossil record going back to the time when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. It's very ancient. It has a lovely yellow fall color. These can be medium to actually quite large trees, very irregular shape to the crown. But it's thought that they've outlived all their pests. So there really aren't any known pests or disease issues that these have. The main disease issues are really landscape related and planting site related. They are a tree that is divided, the species is divided into male trees and female trees. It's called dioecious. Typically the cultivars that you'll find in the marketplace, like Princeton Century Ginkgo, for example, are male selections to avoid the fruit on the females, and the fruit is, it basically smells like vomit. So it's not attractive. It's not something that you typically want to have around. However, I have seen groupings of these trees, fairly young trees, that I'm reasonably certain were a male selection, have reverted and are growing fruit. And so thereby you get the smell and the mess associated with those. Green ash. So green ash is a large to medium hardy tree that ash trees in general are widely planted in Utah and the Intermountain West. And there are some good cultivars out there by Patmore and like Marshall's Seedless, for example. And those are male selections. Again, another tree where you have male trees and female trees. These are male selections to avoid the problems with the fruit, which then attracts box elderbug. Can potentially feed on green ash. So I don't believe that's true. I got to back up. So green ash, Fraxinus pennsylvanica, is another medium to large tree that is really well adapted to Utah. It can handle the high pH soils, handle the climate really well. It is prone to quite a few pests. It's usually inundated with aphids. I've seen a number of different species of aphids feed on this tree. And it's also prone to lilac ash borer. We've stopped recommending this tree a few years ago when it was discovered in Colorado, a new pest called the emerald ash borer, which is moving through the United States and introduced pest to the United States. And it is destroying pretty much all Fraxinus in North America. Everywhere that it's been found, is decimating the ash populations, both in native stands in mountainous regions in the east, as well as landscape plantings. And so the fact that it's real close to us and was moved into Colorado in firewood that was transported illegally, it could very well be in Utah or easily be moved here. And as such, it will take out these trees. And there really is no long-term solution to control emerald ash borer. Pesticides will work, of course, but it's something that must be repeated every year in order to maintain those trees. And honestly, there's probably other things we can do with that time and money and pesticide. So avoid planting this, even though they are good trees, and you'll see a lot of them around. In some landscapes, they make up a high percentage of the trees in the landscape, which also kind of leads us to tell the story that maybe we should be looking at other species anyway. Golden rain tree, or Coleruteria paniculata, is another hardy small tree. This one's usually typical or well suited for under power lines. It flowers in July. You see the yellow flowers on this tree here, which then give rise to these papery Japanese lantern or Chinese lantern kind of seed pods that have small, hard, dark colored seeds inside. It can be prone to wind damage as the branching structure is a little weak, but it has a lovely form, and the fact that it's drought tolerant adds to its use in landscapes as well. It's quite drought tolerant. There is a fastigate or upright cultivar, Fastigiata, which, as you can imagine, won't have quite the spread of a crown as this one pictured here. But overall, a good small tree for a tough location. Hackberry, Celtis occidentalis. So hackberry is a long, old utilitarian tree, medium to large tree, also drought tolerant. They do tend to get a bit ragged, very irregular shape to them, especially as they get older. Very tough tree. I've seen them doing pretty good in some really tough sites, but they will look tremendously better even with a small amount of care. They're very adaptable to soil. One big problem that we see with hackberry is more of a cosmetic problem. Is they get a small insect that burrows into the leaf and creates a small gall. It's called hackberry nipple gall, which is very unsightly, but otherwise doesn't really cause damage to the tree. And those little midges can be controlled to some extent, but they tend to live and overwinter on the bark and then lay their eggs in the canopy. So it's just something to be aware of. It does change the look of the tree quite a bit to have those. And basically, if you grow hackberry, you're going to have this nipple gall. Hedge maple, Acer campestre. This is a maple that most people have never really heard of, let alone used or even seen in the nurseries. It's a small to medium tree. It can be sheared quite easily or kept small, hence the name hedge maple. It does have nice red fall color, soil adaptability. It's great high pH soils. It can handle the dry air that we get in Utah a lot better than the Norway maple or the Acer platanoides group of maples. It's kind of a utility, or it's good in a lot of areas. It's very adaptable. And Queen Elizabeth is probably the most popular cultivar. Honey locust, or Gladitia triacanthos inermis. So this is the thornless honey locust. That's what inermis means in the scientific name. These are large, pretty fast-growing trees that tolerate clay soils. They can also tolerate some drought, although in my experience, not as much drought as sometimes we read about them being able to tolerate. There's three main cultivars: Imperial, Shademaster, and Sunburst. Sunburst is a variety that has yellow leaves all year long. I don't personally care for it because I don't really like leaves that look like that, because to me the trees look nutrient deficient. But again, this is another tree where there's male and female trees, and so the selections that you find in the commerce are going to be male selections, so they don't bear fruit. But what I have seen, I have an imperial honey locust in my yard, and it does bear some fruit every year, some seed pods, and really they say that they're seedless, but really what those mean most of the time is that they're mostly seedless. They will bear some fruit, but usually not very much. Horse chestnut, or Aesculus hippocastanum. So horse chestnut is another tree that's good for a large landscape or a park. They're very large trees, but they do have these amazing upright white flowers in late spring that the pollinators go crazy for. The fruit, however, is very messy. It's a large spiky ball that is very hard, and it can be very much a nuisance. And because they have very large, broad leaves, they're very prone to leaf scourge. in the summer here. And so that's something to be aware of. We see a lot of leaf scorch on them. And again, it's not anything to do with the plant. It's an environmental issue that we just have dry air and the plants lose more water than they can replace. And so some of the tissue dies back as it dries out. The plant can't replace the water fast enough. So this is one where with some of the maples, particularly the Norway maples, if you can't handle a leaf scorch, then look for a tree that is better adapted. Japanese tree lilac, Syringa reticulata. These trees have gained a lot in popularity over about the past 10 years. This is small to medium trees with white flowers in the spring. They are lilacs in the lilac genus, the Syringa. So they are prone to the lilac borer, the ash lilac borer that ash trees and lilacs are prone to. However, this tree normally does well as a street tree, as a small landscape planting, and those white spring flowers are of course very desirable to have. A lot of people like to have those, but they do well here. They're also quite drought tolerant. Once they're established, they don't need as much water as say the maples and the ashes. Japanese maple or Acer palmatum. These are small to medium trees. Usually we consider small, very slow growing. They come in a wide variety of leaf colors and shapes. They do best in Utah in a shady location, and where they grow natively is more as an understory plant, so they're used to genetically adapted to some shade. The cultivar that's pictured here with the red leaves is Bloodgood, and out of all the Japanese maple, that's probably the one that people have the most success with overall, because the leaves are not as finely divided and tend to not dry out quite as fast. But again, here you can see in this picture that is planted in a location that gets quite a bit of afternoon shade, and that tends to be a lot of what makes these successful when people have success with them, is that afternoon shade. The really fine leaf cultivars, they don't do as well. They really need a lot more humidity and shade and a cool area, or they just really struggle because of the dry air. They just can't keep those delicate leaves hydrated in our dry environment in the summer. Kentucky coffee tree, Gymnocladus dioicus. This is another tree where there's male and female trees, so dioecious. Very hardy, quite a large tree, although they tend to get more broad than they do tall. Adaptable to many soils, is really adaptable to high pH soils. They tend to do well here. Drought tolerant. The males don't get the seed pods, which I think actually the seed pods on the female trees are quite pretty. They're very large, oversized pea pods. They were used in earlier days of the country as a substitute for coffee, where the beans were ground and roasted. And this is a tree that to me has some of the most interesting architecture for winter interest of any. It's just quirky, gnarly, fun angles, really cool, thick bark. Really has a lot of winter interest. But you can look for male cultivars as well, which most of the ones in commerce will be male cultivars. And a real popular one is called Espresso. A little leaf linden. So there's actually a group of lindens. There's 3, possibly even 4 lindens that grow well here. Little leaf is one of them. They're medium to large trees. Excuse me. Very fragrant blossoms that bees love. Linden blossoms. The honey that bees make from linden nectar is very, very sweet. It's very light. It's beautiful honey. But as a group, they're very adaptable. This is one of the probably the most widely planted of the 3 species, and it can get aphids, and that is a potential problem. But it does well here. The other 2 are American linden, Tilia americana, and silver linden, which is Tilia tomatosa. And I think silver linden out of the 3 is the best adapted for Utah, because it has kind of a fuzzy backside to the leaf, which does seem to help it preserve water or conserve water more when the weather gets hot. Norway maple, I've mentioned this a few times, Acer platanoides. These are medium to large trees that grow fairly slow. They don't like wet feet. They're obviously not native to North America, but they are really the most, this as a group, lots of cultivars in this group are very widely planted. They can be very prone to iron chlorosis in the wrong soil, and they get leaf scorch really bad in the summers, just simply because they have a large, broad, thin leaf that is hard for the plant to keep it hydrated. Emerald Queen is super popular. Crimson King is the red leaf cultivar. And then there's a number of other ones out there. You just have to go to the nurseries and kind of see what they have. River birch, or Betula nigra. These are very hardy birches. These grow up through Canada and into Alaska and in the Pacific Northwest. A medium-sized tree, moderate growth, has very interesting shape and texture. It does have an exfoliating bark, which is very attractive for a lot of people. It does well in wet locations typically. I have seen it struggle here in Utah considerably because of the high pH soils. Again, it's native to areas that have much, much lower soil pHs than we have. So it can really struggle from iron deficiencies because of it. And while it can handle wet locations, the iron chlorosis is typically worse when the soil is really wet. So I plant this one with caution, but it is out there and it can make a good tree if it's planted in the right location. Redbud, Cercis canadensis. The most popular cultivar of this one is forest pansy, and it gets kind of a nice reddish leaf color in the summer. But it has pink or white spring flowers, mostly pink. It's a small tree, good for suitable under power lines. It does get seed pods. It is in the pea family, legumes. So it does get seed pods that look like peas. It needs good drainage. It does not handle wet feet. It is quite drought tolerant, and I've seen it used a lot as a street tree. I love this tree, but I don't plant it anymore because my experiences with this tree are that it may live for a while and then just suddenly die. And it does tend to have quite a bit of branch breakage because the branch structure is not terribly strong. But it is a great small understory type, small yard tree. There are also weeping forms available that can potentially add to the way this plant is used. Saucer magnolia is really one of the two main magnolias that grow well in the high pH soils. Southern magnolia, which a lot of people are familiar with from other parts of the country, does not do well in Utah, but this one does. So this is Magnolia soulangeana. It's plenty hardy here. It's zone 4, small to medium. It does produce flowers in the spring. You see the large flowers in the spring that come on just before or with the leaves. Grows fairly well, but it really is more of a small or a large shrub in most cases rather than a small tree, typically because it's multi-stemmed. And in the winter or in the fall, sometimes it needs to be protected from early frost, let it go dormant. But overall, I've seen saucer magnolia do quite well here in many locations in Utah. Star magnolia is the other one. This is a much more delicate, dainty-looking magnolia. It tends to flower a little earlier, even a lot more before the leaves come out typically. But Magnolia stellata. And so 15 feet tall by about 10 feet wide is typical. It can handle part shade, but then also protect it from spring frost. Once it leaves out, or the flowers come out, it is quite susceptible to frost, as it does like to leaf out pretty early. Sweet gum, liquid amber Styraca flua. So this plant is one that's more common in the eastern United States and is adapted to soils of lower pH. It can do okay here in Utah. as a large tree, pretty fast grower, really brilliant red fall color, just lovely fall color. But because it's native to areas where it's used to soil pHs being much lower, it needs good drainage. And even with that, it tends to show some iron chlorosis. So lack of being able to utilize the type of iron that we have in our soils here. But otherwise, it's a good tree. I see a lot of them. There's a lot of these down, for example, at BYU, but they're planted in berms where the drainage is really, really good. And most of them do pretty well with only small amounts of chlorosis. London plane tree, or Platanus x acerifolia. This is a large tree planted as a street tree and a pollution tolerant tree for many, many years. Quite a fast grower. It has beautiful exfoliating bark, very, very soil tolerant, tolerant of high pH, salt. Leaves can remain on the tree for a long time in the winter. This tree is the bane of a lot of landscapers because it tends to drop a few hundred leaves every day for about 3 or 4 months in the fall, maybe even a little longer. We used to recommend this tree a lot. We've stopped recommending this also, to a large part, at least I have, because of a disease called sycamore anthracnose, which is a fungal disease that is devastating London plane trees in the area. So plant pathologists seem to think that it doesn't actually kill the tree; it just kills the growing points, and then it causes the lateral buds to then break dormancy and grow, which gives a witch's broom effect. But we've seen here in Utah County, for example, a lot of trees actually, it looks like they've just simply been killed by the damage that anthracnose is causing. And yes, you can spray for it, but to spray a very large tree with a fungicide every year becomes a very expensive task. And so we're not recommending this one as much. Some cultivars are reported to be a little bit more tolerant or resistant to anthracnose. In my experience, that tolerance or resistance seems to be very minimal, and that all of these trees are succumbing to anthracnose. Tatarian maple, Acer tataricum. This is a small tree. Again, another one, an understory type tree, good for power lines and small yards. Moderately growing, kind of irregular crown. It does have a nice red fall color. Very adapted to soils. This out of the small maples, for example, Tatarian maple and hedge maple, Tatarian maple and Amur maple. This is the better of the two. Out of the Tatarian and Amur maple, this is the better of the two. It's way more tolerant of high pH soils. And there's some nice cultivars out there, Rugged Charm, Hot Wings, which has a really brilliant fall color and a really nice color to the seeds as well. Zelkova serrata. So another hardy vase-shaped tree, typically quite large. It was used and still is used as a replacement for American elm. The leaves have a kind of a similar appearance to elm, and it is actually in the elm family, but is very resistant to Dutch elm disease. So it's also quite drought tolerant and is used successfully in larger areas as street trees or utility trees, and areas that may not get as much care. Some really popular cultivars are Green Vase, which is pictured here. It's very upright cultivar. Village Green, which actually I prefer better because it's more of a broad canopy, a little bit wider form, and Wireless, which is a newer cultivar that is suitable for use under power lines. It only tops out at about 20 feet tall, just a very, very broad canopy, but not very tall tree. Austrian pine, Pinus nigra. This is, out of all of the evergreens, the needled evergreens, pines typically do the best out of the firs, the spruces, and the pines in landscapes because they're the most adaptable. Austrian pine has a relatively straight trunk. It's good as a park tree or in a larger landscaped area typically. They are quite overplanted, and they are susceptible to iron chlorosis in soils here in Utah. They typically don't live a long time because they don't like the heavier soils as much. But I've seen a number of large Austrian pine that have been around for many, many years. Bosnian pine is a good alternate to Austrian pine. Pinus heldrechii, and is smaller. They can get big, but they grow really, really slowly and have a tight shape. So even at maturity, they have a much tighter upright branch structure and are a good replacement for Austrian pine, especially in smaller landscapes, because they are much more compact and slower growing. Scotch pine, or Pinus sylvestris, these are really hardy. One of their notable characteristics is that they have red bark that exfoliates. They have a lot of character. You can see that the canopies can get a little irregular and kind of fun. There are a number of different cultivars of Scotch pine. Fastigiata is the upright one that is pictured on the left. There's another ground cover variety that will really only grow about 2 feet tall and just kind of meanders along the forest floor or the landscape, and looks really, really pretty. Overall, it's quite well adapted to landscapes and is used quite a bit. White fir, or Abies concolor. Firs, out of all the firs, this one, white fir, is the most adaptable to landscape situations. It can handle the higher temperatures typically and the higher pHs that are found in landscape soils versus the mountain soils. They tend to have a bluish color. There are some varieties that are a little bit more green, but if they're seed propagated, the colors can be all over the place. They have a soft needle, so firs are often called friendly firs because the needles are soft, flat, and as a large tree, it's quite water wise, although I've seen them do pretty well in landscapes that get a lot of irrigation as well. There are other firs that can be planted. One other one that I see planted a lot is subalpine fir, which is native to Utah, as well as white fir is also native to Utah. But that subalpine fir, or Abies lasiocarpa, is much less tolerant of these landscape conditions. Limber pine, or Pinus flexilis. These are the pines that have very soft needles. They're native to Utah and in our mountain regions, but there's a couple of cultivars, Vanderwolf and Extra Blue, which is, you can imagine, has a lot more of a bluish color to it because of the waxy coating on the leaves that are quite popular. These cultivars are pretty popular in commerce in the landscape. But a good one to plant here, especially if you like a little bit of a softer look, maybe even slightly weeping. Colorado spruce, we mentioned this already. Picea pungens may not be the best choice for a lot of landscapes because we limit the rooting volume so much from these broadly rooted trees. They come in blues and greens and all manner of sizes, with dwarf versions popping up all over the place. They are somewhat drought tolerant. It's the state tree of Utah. Actually, it's not the state tree of Utah anymore. I need to update this. So Colorado blue spruce, or Picea pungens, as we've kind of mentioned a little bit already, may not be a good choice for a lot of landscapes, especially smaller landscapes. Somewhat drought tolerant once established, and certainly the roots may be a little deeper in areas where they're not getting water, where the lawn is getting watered. They can be blue or green, and that's just dependent on cultivar and whether or not they're seed propagated. There are a lot of cultivars of Colorado spruce, like Fat Albert, for example, which is a very dwarfing, broad spreading tree, grows very slowly. And then Hoopsie and Baker Eye are a couple of other main cultivars there. But there's a lot of them out there. But just be cautious. And for most landscapes, you'll probably want to find some sort of a dwarf version of those. Blue Atlas cedar, or Cedrus atlantica glauca. This is a zone 5. This is one of the true cedars, a true cedar. So the cedars that we typically grow in Utah, that we, even Cedar City with all the cedars on the mountain, they are actually junipers. They are not true cedars. But Blue Atlas cedar is one of the true cedars, as well as Cedar of Lebanon. Both of these hail from that area and are lovely landscape plants. They're typically large, moderate to fast growers. The blue varieties have a waxy coating on the leaf that gives them that blue color, but there are also green cultivars as well as the weeping varieties that you see here. But these are large trees. I see these Blue Atlas cedars planted a lot on new homes, especially model homes where they don't have a lot of room at the foundation. They're planted really close to the base of the house. And those look great for the first few years, but these trees get very, very large and will need to be removed pretty soon. And within probably 10 years, they should be removed at least, because they tend to grow pretty quick. And I mean, we're talking about a tree that will easily get 50 feet tall and have a really broad spreading, although it's an open canopy, a really broad spreading canopy. So like this, you can see that those kinds of trees are probably not best situated real close to a house. So there we've got Blue Atlas cedar, mature in a wooded setting. It's very lovely. Cedar of Lebanon, another true cedar, Cedrus libani. A little bit less hardy, but also large, moderate growing, very graceful trees. You can see those long, very broad spreading branches. And you can see in the inset picture, the cone. You'll never see a cone from a cedar, just like you won't from a fir, intact, unless you can climb up and look at the top of the tree where the cones are produced. These cones, like with firs, disintegrate as they mature and come down just pieces at a time, small scales at a time, releasing the seeds as they fall apart. And so you might find piles of scales around the base of the tree, but you won't find intact cones. Giant sequoia, Sequoiadendron giganteum. These are zone 5 trees, so in the warmer parts of Utah, these will do okay, but the higher mountain areas probably not. These are huge trees. Obviously, in the Pacific Northwest, this is one of the major species, one of the 2 main species in the redwood forests up there. There are also some pendulous or weeping forms that are a little smaller. They can experience a lot of drought stress when full grown here, especially because they're not really native to a really arid climate where we are. So I've seen big ones doing well in a number of locations in Utah. So they are a possibility. They won't get as big as they do in the Northwest because of the climate difference, but they tend to be quite adaptable to the soils we have and to the landscape situation. But even though they don't get as large as they do in the Northwest, they still need a big area. These are giants among trees. Bald cypress, Taxodium distichum. This is a large tree. It's one of a small group of deciduous conifers. So that means it's a conifer like the firs, the spruces, the pines, and the cedars, but it loses its needles in the fall. And that's what's shown here is the needles are turning that really nice color and really nice fall color. And it's very adaptable to soils. So this is one I recommend. And in fact, we planted at Thanksgiving Point in an area where a lot of soil, a lot of surrounding hillsides off the golf course actually drain to an area. And it's really wet there all the time. And we planted these trees there and they're really happy. These natively grow in swamps, so they can handle very waterlogged soils or even standing water. And they have some unique adaptations that allow them to deal with that, to still get oxygen to their root system. So these work well in a lot of those areas. Very, very lovely, graceful trees. There's a weeping form as well, Cascade Falls, and there's a more of an upright version that we planted at Thanksgiving Point. Larch or Larix decidua. This is another deciduous conifer, like the bald cypress we just talked about. Very tolerant of a wide range of soil conditions, can handle wet or dry, but does not deal well with compacted soils. So I have known of people to have removed this tree after the needles have fallen off because they think it died, but that it's normal for it to shed its needles every fall.
I'm interested to know the best place to plant a honey locust tree.
Okay, so one of the things to look at on honey locust is, of course, the size. There are several cultivars. Some of them are larger than others. They usually do well as street trees or planted in mow strips, parking lots, those kind of areas. So I have one in my back garden area, not a huge space, but so I'm not exactly sure if that's what you're looking for, or
Yeah, just kind of knowing where in the landscape it would do the best.
Okay, I'm trying to go to where.
It likes a lot of sunshine, right? Not
Yeah,
blockage.
it's a full sun, and okay, that's a great point. And typically speaking, you're going to see the larger trees are all going to need full sun, and when you get into some of the smaller trees, that's when they can start to handle a little bit more shade. So, for example, Japanese maple is an understory tree; it's more shade tolerant. Tartarian maple is more shade tolerant as an understory tree. So the smaller trees are oftentimes more shade tolerant, but for by and large, most trees are going to need at least a good 6 hours to 8 hours of sun to really do their best. So, okay, curious about magnolias. There are several magnolias that grow well here, and I think in a lot of areas you can actually even get away with southern magnolia. The real big southern magnolia is hardy enough to plant here, but it's not as well adapted to the high pH soils that we have here. But saucer magnolia and star magnolia are both good to plant here. They both do well here. I've seen them in a number of locations, including Red Butte Garden and various places throughout Salt Lake and Utah counties. But I don't recommend southern magnolia, mostly because of the soil chemistry issues. And the pros and cons of poplars. So poplars, they fall into that fast tree category, and so for most home landscape situations, I don't recommend them because they just simply are too big. And then they also have a lot of wood that falls out of them. So they're weak wooded, and they grow fast and they die fast. So they just become problematic that way. But there's nothing inherently wrong with them. I mean, they're well adapted to the area. But just make sure that you put them in a space that can handle that and be tolerant of the space that can handle their size, and be tolerant of the fact that they're going to be messy. They're going to be trashy trees.
What about Australian pines?
So Austrian pine does well here. It's probably that one and Scotch pine. Well, there's three. There's Austrian, Scotch, and Ponderosa pine. Those three make up the vast majority of the pines that are used in landscapes. And as a group, pines are more tolerant of landscape situation than the firs and the spruces. So it does fine. Austrian pine does fine here in most situations. But with all the pine trees and all the conifers, generally speaking, what we think of as a typical needled evergreen conifer, they need soil that drains pretty well. So if you're going to plant them in the areas that have more heavy soil, they can do okay. Just plant them high, plant them a little bit burned, so that they get good drainage off of the top of that soil.
Mike, I wanted to clarify ponderosa, and you know this too. It is a crappy tree for our soil in the valleys. It grows well on granitic and coarse-based soils, but on our limestone-based soils in the valley, it gets iron chlorosis really bad, and a lot of times over 15 or 20 years, they just decline and die.
Yeah, and
If you
that's a
plant it,
great point. We're actually seeing that to some extent starting to happen at Thanksgiving Point now, where a lot of those trees there, the ponderosa there, um, and in other places that I've seen them, has hit that 20-year mark. The needles get really pale green, and they really start to decline. So good point. Yeah,
Do they
Bosnian pine does good here too. Yep.
do well planted like in shade, by shade? Do they need full sun?
All full sun, all the way. Conifers don't tolerate shade. The only conifer that is reasonably shade tolerant are the yews.
Hmm.
There's English yew and Japanese yew. There's a whole bunch of those, and most of them are hybrids, and so it's hard to even pin down the parentage on them. But they're pretty shade tolerant. In fact, they almost prefer some shade. So I see a question from Becky about planting a tree too deep and lifting it doesn't seem possible. Digging around the base be helpful in removing soil from the base. It probably won't help a whole lot because of the fact that the root systems tend to spread a whole lot. So you'd have to excavate a pretty large area of soil. And most likely the root system, if it's a few years old, most likely the root system is already adapted as well as it can to the area. And so it's probably best just to leave them alone. All right, what else?
somebody asking about mulberries and park strips.
Oh yeah, bad idea.
If you hate your neighbors, you can plant the fruiting kind right on the border and make sure that all the fruit drops in their yard along with the
Exactly.
bird poop.
Yeah, they're typically a large tree. Um, Now, if the most strip is a little bit bigger, then you could plant maybe the weeping mulberries, which tend to not be very large, like the chaparral. It's mostly fruitless as well, not entirely, but mostly. So those might be an option, but I'd really be looking at a most strip that is probably 5 to 6 feet wide at least.
There's a question about small trees for most strips.
Oh gosh, yeah, there's lots of good small trees for most trips. Just overall, a general group of trees that I would recommend looking at for most trips would be the hawthorns. Most of them are thorny, although not all of them are. For example, there's a thornless cockspur hawthorn, which is one of my most favorite trees. I have one in my yard, and it's just lovely. It tends to have a rather broad canopy, so it may need to be trimmed and trained to be a little bit more upright if it's near a sidewalk or a road. Honey locust does good. Zelkovas, some of the smaller forms of Zelkova will do well typically. But basically what we're looking for is trees that are salt and drought tolerant, and then looking for dwarf forms of those trees or just naturally small trees. Crab apples do well typically because most of them don't get bigger than about 15 feet tall. And then that kind of ties us into the whole idea of, well, you get these roots that tend to push up sidewalks and stuff. And sometimes people say, well, the trees don't root deep enough. That's why they're having these surface root issues and why they're pushed on the sidewalks. And that's not entirely true. If a tree gets big enough, it has to increase its buttress enough to support it. And as that buttress swells, then it's going to raise the sidewalks. And so really what it boils down to is if the tree is lifting sidewalks and causing damage to concrete structures and things like that, it's probably the wrong tree for that spot. As a smaller tree that's just genetically less prone to do that is going to be the better solution. Redbud could be a good choice in park strips. Choke cherries. I don't know, Tom, do you have any other ideas right off the top of your
There's a
head?
couple of newer crab apples that are a little bit columnar. There's one called Oh, now I put myself on the spot. But they're starting to become available. Progressive has them, and even newer. I'm becoming more of a fan of crab apples because most of the newer varieties, the fruit's very persistent, and the birds just pick it off in the winter. And so
Well,
not only do
yeah,
you not have a mess, but you get some wildlife in there if you like to watch birds.
yeah, and the fruit tends to be small, and so you don't get the sour mash from the fruit, that falls on the ground in the winter. So overall, there's a lot of good crab apples out there, and I see them used a lot as street trees. But my opinion is on street trees is keep them small, keep them genetically able to fit that small space that they're in, and they'll perform better for you with less problems.
Do you want to address fruitless pear trees?
Is there such a thing?
No.
Even the ornamental pears tend to produce a lot of fruit.
And they drop in the dead middle of winter and make a
Mhm.
slimy mess all over your sidewalk.
They also tend to have about a 20-year lifespan, and they kind of undergo this mystery decline that we haven't really been able to figure out why they do it. And they're really prone to fire blight and spreading fire blight to some of the other plants like our apple trees. And then Lynette asking, will tree roots break into water or sewer pipes? This is a myth. By and large, it's a myth. Roots don't go down in there and they think, oh, this is a pipe, and if I bust through it, there's a whole bunch of water and nutrients there, kind of with a sinister laugh. That's not how it works. They will exploit a leaking pipe. And if a pipe is growing in an area where there's root expansion or the root diameter is getting bigger, like if it's lifting a sidewalk and a pipe gets caught in there and the tree lifts the pipe up and causes the pipe to crack, then it will exploit the fact that there's water and nutrients there. So then they will grow through there and the roots can proliferate inside the pipe. But they're not seeking pipes out, and unless the pipe is leaking or is being exposed to those kind of thrust pressures from the roots, then tree roots and pipes can coexist just fine.
Actually, I have a question about your giant sequoia. Do they actually grow well here?
Yeah, there's a lot of them planted here. There's actually some that are getting to be about, well, they must be 40 or 50 feet tall up at Red Butte Garden. I've seen them planted there's some planted at the Orem Arboretum. I know of some landscapes that have them. Orem High had one until they tore it out when they remodeled. So yeah, they're around. They can actually do well here. They're not going to get that big like they do in the redwood forest because we don't have a climate that'll sustain that. But as far as their hardiness goes, they seem to be able to handle things just fine.
There are several on the Orem bench. There's actually a few down in Santaquin that is 4 or 5 degrees colder than Provo and Orem in the winter at night. I would not plant them in Heber and mountain valleys.
All right. So Amy's asking about wisteria. So wisteria is one of those woody shrubs or woody vines. If they don't flower, you need to stress them out.
Walk around them with a pair of loppers and just kind of snap them together.
Take the axe and lean it up,
Yeah.
lean it up in the bark of the tree.
Yeah, get your round up and just show the bottle to them.
Exactly. So what I've heard, I've never had to do this, but what I've heard other people have addressed this question is they take their shovel and they go out about 3 feet away from the base of the plant and they just cut through all the surface roots. They just cut straight down, go around in a circle around the plant, and cut off a bunch of the roots and stress it out a little bit, and they usually get it to flower. So is it typical that they won't flower? No. Is it unheard of? No, it does happen. It might also be related to they're a little bit lush, meaning that they might get too much fertilizer and maybe a little too much water.
If they're improperly pruned, because they
Exactly.
flower off 1-year-old wood.
Yep. So you have to be real careful about how you prune them because they'll flower this year on wood that was produced last year. So if you go back and remove all that, then there's just no flower buds left because those flower buds develop over the winter. So if that's the case, wait till after it flowers and then prune it.
I had a question about earlier you had a picture of a tree that was split. The bark was split up the middle, was damaged. I have one like that. Is there anything I should do for it, or is it just going to do what it does?
So it will do what it does. There isn't any bandage or anything that's recommended for it. There's no paint or any tree wound repair stuff. That's usually more harmful than it is helpful. What the only thing you really can do going forward is to try and prevent the damage from getting worse. So if the tree's healthy and you can prevent future damage like that from happening, a lot of times they can recover from it. They'll regrow. They'll gradually re-enclose that with healthy tissue. So what I would recommend is that you just either paint it white every 2 years, or just use a white tree wrap fabric. You can buy it in rolls. It's for about 4 inches wide, and you can get it in rolls, a small roll or a really big roll. At the full service nurseries is where I've seen that, and that's what I use on my trees typically. And then you put it on in October, November, and take it off in March or April. And it's not to insulate the tree; it's just to reflect the sunlight away from the base of it, away from the south side of the trunk.
Hey, Mike, this is Evan. Question about saving some trees. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. So I have an office on 5th West and Provo, and they're widening that street and digging it out. They put netting around these trees they're supposedly going to save, and then they've dug within about 3 feet of them and dug down about 3 feet, and I can see all kinds of roots sticking out. Do I just expect that they'll die, or what do I
Yeah,
expect?
most likely. The sad reality is that in most cases, landscape contractors or just contractors generally ignore the barriers that are put up around trees to try and protect them. Even when an arborist is involved, unless there's specific fines and penalties put in place and somebody to enforce them, those barriers go ignored. And so typically they want to keep everything away from at least the drip line, and sometimes even a little farther out is the minimum. And so if it's just one small portion of the root system that they're doing this in, and the rest of the root system is going to remain unaffected, then the tree will probably recover from it, and we may not really see too much of a problem. But if it's kind of just generally affecting the whole root volume of that tree, then I would expect them to go into a pretty rapid decline, and probably within the next 5 years, they're probably not going to look like much.
Mike, I have one more if I can.
Sure.
I've got a sort of a farm that's part of it's been taken over with Russian olives. How can I kill them?
So actually, some colleagues of ours down in Carbon and Emery County, where this is a huge problem on rangeland and farms, they've done a lot of research on effective ways to remove and kill Russian olive. Basically, what the recommendations are, we can just condense it all down, is they cut them off, and immediately, within seconds if possible, they paint the stump of the tree with Roundup, a concentrated Roundup, like the 42% ultra concentrate. Don't dilute it. They paint it on with a brush, or they actually have a sprayer, and they looked at different ways that the herbicide was applied or sprayed or whatever. But the bottom line is it got a lot of herbicide on the stump as soon as it was cut, immediately. And it, I don't know, it was somewhere probably around the 80 or 90% control rate. Ton, if Ton remembers differently, he can chime in. But the control rate was pretty good if they got the herbicide on really fast.
If they got the herbicide on, especially glyphosate, they were having, I think, 95 or 96% control in the best groups if it was done well.
There was some word about Toradol. Is that
Probably
dangerous?
Tordon, and you never want to use that in your yard.
Yeah, if you have nothing else in the area that you want to keep alive, then you can use Tordon. And I think Tordon is restricted use anyway.
Well, there's a ready to use, and that's the
Oh,
problem, is
okay.
that many garden centers and farm stores have been recommending it.
Yeah.
And if you read the label, it's not labeled for use in residential areas.
Because
The
that one,
active in it gets into the soil and stays there for 2 years, and it kills any other perennials or shrubs that are broadleaf near those roots.
yeah, and if the roots grow into the area, it will kill the plants if they grow into the area. And the problem is with Tordon is it leaks out of the root system and gets absorbed into, and so then it becomes soil active. And so that's why it's good for roadsides and pasture areas sometimes where there's really
And professionals that know what they're doing with it.
But I would avoid it. I really would avoid it.
Summer leaf scorch on Norway maple.
Yeah, that's actually to be expected. any large leafed, any plants with large or really broad, thin leaves are going to have leaf scorch in the summer. It's a factor of dry air and wind, and that these plants aren't adapted to the climate that we're making them live in. So we see a lot of leaf scorch on maples. We also see a lot of leaf scorch on things like chestnuts too. And it's just to be expected. It's environmental, and there's nothing really you can do to prevent it. And proper watering practices can minimize it, but it won't usually prevent it from happening. It's just simply related to the fact that the plant can't move water fast enough to the leaves, even if there's plenty of soil moisture. The plumbing is just not robust enough to move the water fast enough.
And maple trees producing lots of seeds every 2 or 3 years is very common, and it's just comes with planting a maple
Yep.
tree.
That's normal. It'll produce real heavy, and then it'll run out of energy, and it'll take a couple of years to produce it again. It's like with fruit trees. We would actually prune fruit trees to avoid that problem, but maple trees don't follow that guideline.